Hello, my fellow Alaskans. How are you all out there doing today? We are in day 3 of the Kowalke versus Eastman case here in the Palmer Courthouse. The show is about to begin. If you are able to watch this virtually right now, please like and share this video. The more Alaskans that we get involved in this, the better off that we are. Again, you can always catch a replay of this video on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Rumble within the next 6 to 12 hours. This is also being streamed on NorthTube and our website, Politadick.com. Please make sure to like and share today. We are in day 3. Jon Lewis was the person on the stand yesterday. I'm not too sure if he's going to be the first witness being brought up here today, but this case is continuing on. Again, get your popcorn popped, your shot glasses filled up, and get ready. This is going to be one hell of a show. I'm going to go ahead and go radio silent here so it's in the courtroom, and as soon as they begin, I will turn the volume back on. Again, please like and share this video. Do we got a volume or a microphone issue here? Yeah, I won't do that again. All right, thank you guys all for being here today. Again, please like and share this video. Sorry about the audio problems there. That's why I'm doing a pre-test before the show actually gets started. Looks like being able to charge things as this is going on is not going to be able to happen. Thank you guys all for being here. Please go to Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, NorthTube, Rumble. Like, share, subscribe, click that button and be notified. We are live here at the Palmer Courthouse. The court case is just about ready to begin. There is day 3 of the Kowalke versus Eastman case, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I am using my own Wi-Fi on my cell phone for this broadcast. They don't have enough internal Wi-Fi to even make this thing go live, so hopefully we'll keep connection here all day long. I am set up to stream non-stop from start to finish. Again, please like and share this video. It's your support that makes things like this happen. Go to our website, Politadick.com, click that support button. All proceeds go right back into affording just things like the gas to be able to make it to places like this here today. Again, thank you all for being here, and don't forget, like and share this video. They are about ready to begin. I'm going to go ahead and shut my voice down here so that you guys can all listen in on what's going on in the room. And again, this case is just about ready to begin. Thank you all for being here, and if you can come on down to the courthouse and show your support, we are here all day until 4:30. Thanks once again for being here. Like, share this video, and I'll talk to you a little bit later. And just to make sure, I got the other microphone now plugged in and operating. It should be up and functioning with no static or sound. Let's make sure everything is good to go.
Alaska's now in session now on the Alaskan Voices Votes.
Yeah, please be seated, everybody. Good morning, everybody. We're back on record in Kowalke versus Eastman, 3 a.m. 22-7404 CI. We have the parties here present that are present in the courtroom. We have Mr. Dedukian here and Mr. Kowalke. Mr. Miller here representing Eastman. Pull up Zoom here. Okay, apologize, I also got the Zoom up, my oversight there. So we've got, I can see Ms. Harrison representing the division here, present on the Zoom. And Ms. Harrison is, I do see Mr. Flynn there as well. No video, but it looks like he's listening in. So before we continue with the presentation of evidence, first of all, I just want to check in with the parties. Are the parties ready to proceed today?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Judge.
Okay, so before we get moving, I'm going to ask the parties for some additional briefing on two issues. That's obviously not due immediately. You guys are here in court, and I'm going to give you at least until Monday to give me answers to these two questions. But there's related to two issues that have, as we've gotten into the trial, the issues have largely crystallized as what the proof is going to be, and so I would appreciate the parties briefing on two questions. The first is, was the original intent or understanding of Article 12, Section 4 that membership in an organization was enough to bar a member from, of the organization from public office absent conduct or speech on the part of the member? And please assume for purposes of that question that the organization has used force to attempt to overthrow the U.S. government. And so the point of that question is we've already briefed and the parties have discussed what are the constitutional limits for the type of conduct or speech that is not protected by the First Amendment. My question is focused on Article 12, Section 4 of the Alaskan Constitution, looking at the history of it and the reason why it was passed back at the time that our Constitution was adopted. It seems pretty clear that from the historical context that just membership alone was assumed by the founders or the drafters to be enough to bar from public office. And so if the parties disagree with that, or if the parties have any thoughts on that, I'm inviting them to share them with the court. Second, I'm also asking the parties for additional briefing on whether or not the First Amendment, the 14th Amendment, or other sections of the Alaska Constitution require more than just that mere membership, as I think it was originally understood by the drafters of the Alaskan Constitution. So it's clear from the briefing that we had earlier that association for unprotected purposes is not protected, but what about association for ostensibly protected purposes, but the organization has alternative or additional aims? So essentially, does there need to be a nexus or connection as that's required, if not by the Alaska Constitution, then by other Article 12, Section 4, but then other portions of the Alaska Constitution or the United States Constitution? These are two issues that I think the parties have largely been talking around, and the court's been talking around, but they're two that I would appreciate explicit positions from the party about what is required. I recognize that I'm not trying to move the goalposts on the plaintiff as far as what I've said originally needed to be proved in the case. The reason I'm asking these questions is, first of all, the constitutional issue was raised and it needs to be addressed. The second is that I did allow for discovery essentially on these topics, the connection between, if there was any Representative Eastman and any of those seditionist or attempts to overthrow the government by force by the plaintiff. And so if that evidence exists, the plaintiff should have gotten it in discovery. And so that's why I feel like even though we're in the middle of trial, this is an issue that I think can be fairly addressed and should be addressed by the parties, and I would like to address it from the court. Do the attorneys have any questions regarding the issues that I've asked, or clarification that you'd like?
No, Your Honor.
Judge, I think we got it.
All right. Ms. Harrison, let me just zoom back up here. Is the division going to be filing as well? I'd ask for a close of business by Monday, recognizing where we're at in the trial, but I'd just like to know if the division's going to weigh in, or it's up to you if you want to or not.
I will have to consult with my client to see how they want to proceed on that.
Okay, it'd just be helpful, if nothing else, to know by that point if the division's going to take a position.
Absolutely. I will file something on Monday, and if it's a simple, notice that the division is not taking a position on these issues, I'll make sure that that's in front of you, Judge. That's fine.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we were in the middle of Mr. Miller's cross-examination of the witness, Mr. Lewis. I do see that Mr. Lewis is present here on Zoom. Good afternoon to you, sir. Good morning from here. Mr. Miller, are you ready to proceed?
I am, Judge.
And we're still continuing. That's the plan for this, to continue with this witness.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Mr. Miller?
Okay. So, Mr. Lewis, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think your position is that Oath Keepers members' loyalty is first to Stewart Rhodes and then to the U.S. Constitution. Is that correct?
The individuals who traveled to the U.S. Capitol along with Stewart Rhodes, that is certainly the case. They followed Stewart Rhodes there as part of their membership in that organization. I cannot speak to the individual loyalty of every one of the 38,000 claimed members who have at one point donated or attended a meeting of the Oath Keepers, of where their personal loyalties may lie.
So are you moving from your statement that you made earlier in this case that Stewart Rhodes is the Oath Keepers is Stewart Rhodes?
No, I don't believe I have.
You don't remember saying the Oath Keepers is Stewart Rhodes?
No, I don't believe I have moved from that point. That is still a position I maintain based on the evidence available to me.
Well, how do you square that then with the 30,000+ members that weren't in Washington, D.C. on January 6th?
I don't see any meaningful correlation to be made between the personal decisions of if 38,000 individuals choose to travel to the U.S. Capitol or if they don't, with the fact that Stewart Rhodes used his position as founder, president, and lifetime chairman of the board to call his 38,000 members to the U.S. Capitol. There could be any myriad number of reasons why any one of them did not choose to make the trip, reasons that I do not have the ability to speculate on, but certainly which do not change my expert opinion on Stewart Rhodes using his position in that way.
In general, the membership of Oath Keepers, they hold in higher priority the views of Stewart Rhodes than the Constitution?
I have no ability to declare one way or the other what every single individual member did. I believe the statement I made yesterday is that, by and large, despite what the bylaws of the Oath Keepers illustrate as Stewart Rhodes wrote them, Stewart Rhodes did not truly believe that their loyalty was to the true intent of the Constitution. He viewed every individual Oath Keeper as the sole arbiter of what was and was not constitutional, in the sense that if an Oath Keeper believed that a law was unlawful or unconstitutional, that they can and should disobey it, despite any legal, meaningful basis for that belief.
In the individual Oath Keeper members' perspective of what is and isn't constitutional based upon their own assessment, is that also, in your opinion, informed by Stewart Rhodes?
It is certainly informed by Stuart Rhodes in as much as the anti-government ideology of Stuart Rhodes permeated throughout the organization, and members of the organization who followed the social media posts of the Oath Keepers, the posts on the website by the Oath Keepers, and related public statements by Stuart Rhodes from their foundation through January 6th were undoubtedly aware of the beliefs of Stuart Rhodes in as much as it related to questions of the peaceful transfer of presidential power, the validity of the election, issues of that nature.
So perhaps saying the Oath Keepers are an extension of Stuart Will may be just a little too broad, right?
No,
Well, I mean, you haven't interviewed any Oath Keepers. You've already admitted to that, right?
correct.
And you understand that they take an oath to the Constitution, not an oath to Stuart Rhodes.
I understand the oath that they take upon joining the Oath Keepers, yes, sir.
And you also understand that there have been state organizations which you deemed autonomous that have actually gone in a different direction than Stuart Rhodes on a number of different occasions, right?
There are Oath Keepers affiliates that have publicly distanced themselves from Stuart Rhodes and his national brand, yes, sir.
Florida, North Carolina, and also Arizona, right?
I do not know about Florida, but I would also say it's important to recognize that many of these groups, not just the Oath Keepers, but other domestic violent extremist groups in my expertise, intentionally seek to deceive and misrepresent their true affiliation or their true goals in order to avoid federal or law enforcement pressure, especially in the event that their founder and president is under federal investigation for such conspiracy.
Part of the concern that you have about this group is that their members interpret the Constitution for themselves. I think that's your assessment, right?
Part of my concern is that the group has deemed it necessary frequently to take matters regarding constitutionality into their own hands based on their own personal interpretations of what is and is not lawful. And that at their core, they view the federal government as tyrannical, as overreaching, and as illegitimate.
So, in characterizing the government as illegitimate, that doesn't seem to square very well with the fact that you characterized Stuart Rhodes' perspective of government as not being the enemy during your House testimony in February of this year, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Stuart Rhodes is not what?
Do you recall testifying before the House committee in February where you said that Stuart Rhodes did not view the government as the enemy?
I believe my statement was that Stuart Rhodes viewed Donald Trump favorably, and from 2016 until January 6th, he viewed Donald Trump and his administration writ large far more favorably than he had viewed the previous administration of President Obama. And so from 2016 until January 6th, the core focus of the Oath Keepers' antagonism had shifted from government agencies like the Bureau of Land Management to perceived threats from the left, including Antifa and BLM.
So basically, Stuart Rhodes is a partisan, maybe conservative, Republican, that type of thing?
I cannot speak to Stuart Rhodes' individual belief system writ large, but what I can say is that based on public and private statements by Stuart Rhodes, he viewed Donald Trump and that administration as one that was more favorable and one that they would be given more leeway in their activities in than under a Democratic administration.
So in saying that the Oath Keepers of Stuart Rhodes, Oath Keepers are an extension of Stuart's will, if Stuart Rhodes were no longer the head of Oath Keepers, then that would be a different organization at that point, right?
Would not be a different organization. No, it might evolve, but based on available evidence, including recent public reporting around even some of the so-called splinter chapters that you referenced, like the Arizona chapter that was recently discussed in public reporting, they are still preoccupied with issues of voter fraud, of impending conflict with the government, and of a civil war that will soon take place between the left and the right. So I do not view the organization as having meaningfully changed in terms of their core ideologies in the aftermath of January 6th or the arrest of Stuart Rhodes.
So you marked a number of, I guess, distinguishing features of those that signify to you to be problem organizations. You included in your deposition voter fraud, a concern about vote fraud, right?
I don't believe I used the phrase problem organizations.
Extremist, violent extremist organizations?
Well, yeah, that's certainly not, I didn't and wouldn't say problem organizations. I believe we were discussing a list of violent extremist organizations, and the list I believe you're referencing, and I'm happy to go to the transcript if you're interested, referred to some of the core ideologies and conspiracies of the Oath Keepers and related anti-government organizations had picked up in that time frame.
And I want to correct a representation I made to you yesterday about your deposition in vote fraud. I said that in your deposition that you said that there was some vote fraud. I actually confused your deposition with Mr. Kreiner's. It was Mr. Kreiner who admitted that there was some vote fraud. But in yesterday's testimony, you said there was none in 2020. You're familiar with the ballot harvesting convictions out of Pima County, Arizona?
I am not, no.
Are you familiar with the former Supreme Court justice's work in Wisconsin where they uncovered significant ballot harvesting in nursing homes?
I am familiar with no significant voter fraud that at any point was proven to have meaningfully impacted the results of the 2020 election. I am aware, however, of the numerous lawsuits and other legal mechanisms that were attempted to be used in the fall of 2020, each of which were soundly rejected by courts across the country.
Now, yesterday you said no vote fraud. Today you're saying maybe some, but maybe not enough to affect the outcome of the election. Is that your position today?
I'm saying that in my expertise in domestic violent extremist groups and through my work researching the events and root causes of January 6th, it is clear that the perception of voter fraud was a significant mobilizing concept for those individuals. However, by the time we reached January 6th, as I previously stated, there was no evidence to suggest that there was any meaningful evidence to support any assertions of widespread voter fraud or voter fraud in any way that would change the results of the election or have any meaningful impact whatsoever.
So when you said yesterday there was no vote fraud, what you meant was there was no vote fraud that would be significant enough to change the outcome of the election in 2020?
Yes.
Virtually all your testimony relating to what the Oath Keepers is relates to Stuart Rhodes and relates to statements he's made, how he set up the organization. So I'm trying to square your statement that you just made a few minutes ago that if Stuart Rhodes is no longer the head of Oath Keepers, that it still remains effectively the same sort of organization that you've characterized in your opinion. Is that a misstatement, or would you like to qualify that in some way?
No, as an expert on domestic violent extremist groups in the United States, I'm quite comfortable saying that while to this point in time, up through January 6th and up even through Stuart Rhodes' arrest in January of this year, the group had already been shaped in Stuart Rhodes' image and continued to be an extension of Stuart Rhodes, his will, and his ideology. Even if Stuart Rhodes remains incarcerated, even if he is sentenced, the group remains an anti-government militia. It remains a domestic violent extremist group by any reasonable accounting, including by the U.S. government. It is certainly possible that the group may evolve. I cannot speculate sitting here today how that evolution may look because it has not happened yet.
So again, an extension of Stuart Rhodes' will, it's made in his image, and yet yesterday you said that the Oath Keepers encourages its members, rather than looking to judges to interpret the Constitution, to encourage their own members to read the Constitution for themselves, form their own opinion, and act accordingly. That sounds like an independent, autonomous group, just like you characterized some of the state organizations during your deposition.
I don't believe I called them independent. I said that when it came to their local activities, they had a degree of autonomy. I would certainly not say that the Oath Keepers had autonomous groups.
Okay.
Nor would I say that the fact that Stuart Rhodes frequently brought up constitutional issues as a Yale-educated lawyer and informed his supporters of his personal views, that certainly informed the views of the members who were following Stewart Rhodes, notably those on January 6th.
Okay, but
They
you didn't say that Oath Keepers leader
Excuse me,
Stewart
Your Honor, I
Rhodes.
think he needs to let the witness finish his answer.
Well, he was in the middle of it, sounded like it. Let's find out if there was additional points you wanted to make, and then you can ask your question. Mr. Lewis, were you done answering the question?
No, I would just simply say that Stewart Rhodes encouraged his members to come to their own conclusions around basic facts of law, constitutional questions, while simultaneously doing two things at once here, simultaneously espousing his own views, which were promoted nationally by the organization that he ran in his position as founder, president, and lifetime chairman of the board with veto power. So that, of course, if you're a member of an organization and the leader of that organization, who you have joined that organization in large part because of, is espousing a certain view, it stands to reason that you will likely take on a similar viewpoint as everyone else in that organization.
So really, it was just sleight of hand from your perspective that when Stewart Rhodes said to his members that you should, quote, read the Constitution for themselves, form your own opinion, and act accordingly. He really didn't mean that.
Objection, argumented.
Overruled. Mr. Lewis, you can answer the question.
No, I don't believe he didn't mean that. I believe that he created an environment in which the constitutional questions at hand were ones that intentionally aligned with the worldview of both Stewart Rhodes and the members of the organization, which was formed in direct opposition at that time to the U.S. government. So it stands to reason that the issues that they take up in the perceived view of constitutionalism are, of course, viewpoints that would go against the U.S. government at that time.
You understand that the bylaws specifically state that the membership is responsible for their own actions?
I understand that that is one of the sections of the bylaws, yes.
And I'm referring to Exhibit U, Section 8.04, Code of Conduct. All members must understand that their actions not only reflect on Oath Keepers, but on the entire military, law enforcement, firefighters, first responder, former and current community. We strive to maintain a positive image within our communities and states. All members are fully and solely accountable for their actions while members of the Oath Keepers. You recognize that as part of the Code of Conduct of Oath Keepers, right?
I recognize that the first sentence of that makes clear that their actions reflect on the Oath Keepers as a national organization as well. Yes, sir.
And you also recognize that the rules and bylaws of the organization require members to be fully and solely accountable for their actions while members of the Oath Keepers, right?
I don't believe that is necessarily the case in reality, but I recognize that that is written in the Code of Conduct of the Oath Keepers. Yes, sir.
And you also recognize that the Code of Conduct requires under 8.02, again looking at Section U, that, quote, no person who advocates or has been a member or associated with any organization, formal or informal, that advocates for the overthrow of the government of the United States or the violation of the Constitution thereof shall be entitled to be a member or associate member.
I do recognize that that is written in Section 8.02. Again, I would make the point that based on my expertise and my review, that has not been done in this case or in any previous case in reality.
And you've also characterized the group as having white supremacist leanings, anti-Semitism. You recognize that 8.02b states that no person who advocates or has been a member associated with any organization, formal or informal, that advocates discrimination, violence, or hatred toward any person based upon their race, nationality, creed, or color shall be entitled to be a member or associate member of Oath Keepers.
To be clear, I do not believe I have ever said that the group has white supremacist or anti-Semitic leanings. I believe what I've said is the permissive environment created by the Oath Keepers and Stewart Rhodes allowed for individuals who held white supremacist anti-Semitic beliefs to be members of the Oath Keepers. I have not and will not characterize the group as a white supremacist or an anti-Semitic group. They are an anti-government militia. But yes, to your question, I do recognize that section 802B.
So you don't recall when I asked you in your deposition, and this is at page 19, you made mention in your affidavit and also in your report about the connections between Oath Keepers and white supremacy. You said yes. And is that what you're referring to in what you just said? That it's just connection, that there's not some sort of official position on white supremacy or white nationalism?
Yes, as I just said, connections in that sense, as you asked me in that question and as I answered, there are connections because the Oath Keepers created that permissive environment. In that deposition and in this testimony, and in any of my other previous written or oral remarks, I have not, nor will I in the future, unless a significant change happens, characterize the Oath Keepers as a white supremacist or anti-Semitic organization.
Part of the connection that you've made between white supremacy and anti-Semitism is informed by the Anti-Defamation League, correct?
Yes, sir. That is one of the many points of information I've considered when reviewing those connections that are being discussed here, yes.
Well, in fact, you've drawn a significant connection between right-wing rhetoric, right-wing groups like Oath Keepers, and anti-Semitism, correct?
I didn't use the phrase significant connections, but yes, I have drawn a connection between right-wing rhetoric and anti-Semitism due to the frequent use of anti-Semitic rhetoric by a range of right-wing groups and movements. Yes, sir.
And you've relied heavily in your report on publications from the Anti-Defamation League and drawing your conclusions about the Oath Keepers in general, right?
I have relied on publications by the Anti-Defamation League along with a variety of other organizations and institutions that are widely recognized in my field as leading experts on issues such as anti-Semitism and white supremacy to inform those points. Yes, sir.
Right. It looks like to me in your report you relied on Extremism in American Law Enforcement published by the ADL. Is that correct? You recall that article?
I do recall that article, and yes, that is cited in my expert report.
Oath Keepers Data Leak Unmasking Extremism in Public Life, again by the ADL.
Yes.
Pro-Trump rallies in D.C. attract extremists by ADL.
Yes.
The Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association and Richard Mack, How Extremists Are Successfully Infiltrating Law Enforcement by the ADL.
Yes.
Patriotism, the Edge of Violence, and a right-wing anti-government group by the ADL.
I believe that's also a report by them, yes.
And that was actually an article specifically about Oath Keepers by the ADL, right?
That is my recollection. I'm happy to reference and check, but based on my recollection, yes.
And you characterized yourself as a big fan of the work of ADL, right?
Yes.
I mean, you recognize that there are problems with ADL's work, right?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, they denied the Armenian genocide for over 100 years, up until
Objection,
2016, didn't
relevance.
they?
What's the relevance, Mr. Miller?
I was undercutting the support of ADL for the positions he's written in his expert report. I think inquiring into this should be permitted.
I'll have some inquiry into it, but it's essentially, it's impeaching a source of another to impeach. So
I understand it. I have two more questions. That's going to be short.
As my expert report shows, none of the references I use in compiling my testimony or the expert report relate to the Armenian genocide. So I have no significant knowledge of what the ADL may or may not have done 100 years ago.
Well, I'm not asking about significant knowledge. You understand that for over 100 years, the ADL refused to recognize what happened in Armenia as being genocide. It wasn't until 2016 that they did.
I am neither an expert on the history of the ADL nor the Armenian genocide, so I could not comment one way or the other, unfortunately.
Asking about your knowledge and not asking about your expertise on the ADL. Are you aware?
And I will happily answer again that I have not done research into what organizations may or may not have classified
Mr. Lewis, hold on one
Armenian
second.
genocide.
I'm hearing a no, that he doesn't.
That's not what Your Honor, with all due respect, that's not what he's saying. It's a yes or no answer, and he's giving me something other than a yes or no answer.
All right, Mr. Lewis, are you aware or are you not aware of it?
No, I'm not aware.
Thank you. With respect to up until this past summer, are you aware that ADL characterized racism as being conduct that could only be committed by white people?
Your Honor, I'm gonna object again. I mean, I think that, like you said, he's impeaching another organization that's not involved in this case that happened to be cited in an extra report, and I think it's so far afield that it's irrelevant.
Heavily cited, Judge, heavily cited.
And I'm going to allow a couple more questions on this. Mr. Miller's told me it's going to be brief beyond this, and so the objection's over.
Again, Mr.
No.
Lewis, do you know that the ADL, up until this past summer, characterized racism as being something only that could be committed by white people?
No, I'm not aware of the classification system used by the ADL.
Okay, so you've never heard the racism classification, the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people?
Objection, the witness said he has no personal knowledge about this issue.
I'll let him answer the question on this one, and then he's answered it.
No, sir.
And last question, are you aware that the ADL up until the last few years had refused to criticize anti-Zionist discrimination?
No, sir.
The sources that you've cited, other than sources that you and Mr. Kreiner wrote yourselves, the ADL is the second most cited source in your report, isn't it?
I offhand do not have the breakdown of which sources were cited when in my report. As you listed out there, I certainly relied on their expertise as one of the leading organizations that has analyzed domestic violence streams in the United States in compiling my report.
You characterized the Oath Keepers as, quote, a really disorganized, typically disorganized milieu of actors and movements, and you know everything in between. Do you stand by that statement?
I'm sorry, can I have that one more time, perhaps the context
Sure.
of that statement to refresh my memory?
Yeah, it's in your transcript of your deposition, page 116. You characterized the Oath Keepers as, quote, a really disorganized, typically disorganized milieu of actors and movements, and you know everything in between.
Sorry, you said 116?
Right, and look, I'm asking you a question about your memory right now, and of course, this is one of the problems, Your Honor, with the Zoom connections, is that witnesses can try to refer to other documents, and I direct you, Mr. Lewis, to first answer from memory. If we then have to have you refresh your recollection based upon the document, we can direct you to that, but I'd ask you just to answer the question to the best of your ability at this point.
And Mr. Lewis, just one more additional instruction on top of Mr. Miller's suggestion there. So that the rule is that if, at the moment, you need to testify just from your memory and your recollection. You can't look at anything else. If you do look at something else, you need to let the parties know, and we'll instruct you so you can look at something else. So at the moment,
Yes, Your Honor. I understood.
Mr. Miller, does that address your concern?
It does, thank you, Your Honor, I appreciate that. Do you recall that statement that you made to me?
Offhand, I do not recall it. I would have to review the deposition transcript.
Okay, do you recall also just a couple of pages later calling the Oath Keepers, quote, typically disorganized with largely autonomous state chapters, end quote?
Offhand, I do not remember the context of that statement. I would have to review the transcript.
Didn't ask you about the context, I'm asking you about the statement, Mr. Lewis.
And I would say again, I don't remember the statement or the context in which I made it. I'd have to review the transcript for the totality of that statement.
Well, let me just ask it then. I mean, is it a disorganized, typically disorganized milieu of actors and movements? And you know everything in between?
It is certainly disorganized, but with a hierarchy. I believe it's a fairly nuanced concept that it is difficult to distill into a couple words like that. It is a hierarchical organization that, as we've discussed previously here, gives a degree of autonomy to its local chapters to engage in training and mobilization, while still reporting back to Stuart Rhodes and the national chapter for national mobilization like January 6th.
And typically disorganized with largely autonomous state chapters. Do you stand behind that statement?
When it comes to the local mobilization, yes, they were largely given a degree of autonomy, as I said, for local activities that they choose to engage in. But when it comes to national mobilization, that was exclusively handled by Stuart Rhodes and his board.
And when you're talking about national mobilization, you're talking about the 50 or 60 people that came to DC on January 6th out of the 38,000 members.
I'm talking about events that were advertised as national calls to action on the official Oath Keepers website by Stuart Rhodes, such as the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol.
In which, by your testimony, at most 50 to 60 Oath Keepers showed up for it.
Objection asked and answered many times.
We can address it this one time, but we've covered this subject.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. And how many people showed up at Ferguson from the Oath Keepers?
Offhand, I do not have a full accounting of that. I would speculate a couple dozen.
And how about the Mahi or federal property in Oregon?
Likely roughly similar, but again, offhand, I don't have the full composition in front of me to reference.
The Bunny Ranch standoff?
And roughly similar, again, offhand, I don't have a full accounting of those. They were not the focus of this testimony or my expert report.
How about their hurricane relief efforts? Do you have any familiarity with how many Oath Keepers showed up for those events?
No.
In fact, you haven't provided any information in your report or your testimony regarding any type of humanitarian relief the Oath Keepers conducted during their, since they became an organization in 2009, right?
Correct.
Have you had an opportunity to witness, by your review of the hours and hours of video in January 6th, Oath Keepers assisting law enforcement?
There were several instances in which Oath Keepers purported to be assisting law enforcement by clearing them out of the building. This was something that was discussed at length in the Rhodes trial, yes.
And do you know which Oath Keepers participated in assisting police to depart the Capitol?
Offhand, I do not recall which Oath Keepers co-conspirators who were later charged for their conduct on the U.S. Capitol attempted to use that defense in their trials.
Well, some of the people who were involved in escorting out the police were not charged, right?
Offhand, I do not remember the identities of every single individual who was part of that Oath Keepers group.
And you're also aware of another incident inside the Capitol where Oath Keepers stood between the Capitol Police and the protesters to protect the Capitol Police, right?
Offhand, I'm not familiar with that incident you're referencing.
You've not seen a picture of the Oath Keepers standing in front of Capitol Police inside the rotunda with a crowd on one side and the police on the other?
Not based on my recollection, no.
I want to touch a little bit again on the ideological kind of commonality that you find in the membership of Oath Keepers. And I believe your position is anti-immigrant, conspiracy, vote integrity, stop the steal, globalists conspiring with the enemy to take our freedoms, anti-COVID lockdowns, and anti-BLM. Is that pretty much the big issues for you?
Those are certainly some of the prominent narratives that the Oath Keepers latched onto in recent years. And namely, when we talk about anti-immigrant, we're talking about both this purported wave of caravans as well as the alleged, imagined instances of immigrants coming to this country to illegally vote for Democrats, something that was the cause of multiple mass shootings in the United States.
Right. There have not been any Oath Keepers involved in mass shootings, right?
I did not say that there were, no.
Okay. There's not been any praise from the Oath Keepers about any type of mass shootings, right?
No, but as an extremism expert, it is important to make abundantly clear that the narratives espoused by the Oath Keepers led to acts of mass violence, including the violent assault of the U.S. Capitol. And so you can't really disconnect the rhetoric and the narratives that were espoused from subsequent mobilization by not just the Oath Keepers, but a range of right-wing extremists in that time frame.
And if you recall during your deposition, I mentioned to you that those positions, anti-immigrant, conspiracy, vote integrity, globalists conspiring with the enemy to take our freedoms, anti-COVID lockdowns, anti-BLM, that those are all positions shared by probably the majority of the Republican Party, right?
I do recall you raising that question in my deposition, yes, sir.
And you said you don't know.
I have no ability to speculate on which of those positions may be held by what percentage of individuals in one party or the other.
So it's your position it doesn't matter as to whether or not it's a majority view of one of the two largest political parties in the country. It's your position that these ideas or views should be assessed independent of that.
I think it's important to recognize that those sets of conspiracies were mainly picked up by the right in an attempt to delegitimize the election, to stoke fears over COVID-19 and racial justice protests in the summer of 2020, and that the Oath Keepers, as a right-wing anti-government militia, were part of that effort to both propagate those conspiracies and also radicalize others through those conspiracies.
So I'll try to unpackage this a little bit. So to discredit the 2020 election, now all of these issues that we just went through that list have been prominent positions within conservative movements well before 2020. You understand that, right?
I understand that many of those positions had in some way, shape, or form been picked up by elements of the right prior to 2020, yes.
Well, vote integrity has been a major issue. We already talked about this yesterday for at least 2 or 3 presidential election cycles. Right?
Is that a question? I'm sorry.
Right.
Yes.
And with respect to the COVID lockdowns, those started at the beginning of COVID. That's when the main pushback occurred then, not at the 2020 election.
Which is 2020, so yes.
But again, before the election, well before the election.
Well, I think it's, again, as an extremism researcher and someone who studied January 6th, it's impossible and frankly a little irresponsible to try and pick apart each of these individually as if they existed in a vacuum, as opposed to a trend line where each of these conspiracies is picked up, hacked into this broader set of conspiracies, and then used to mobilize individuals to the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Many of the defendants, again, through my research, begun to be radicalized during the spring of 2020 because of the narratives, the conspiracies, and the false rhetoric around COVID-19 lockdown, anti-mask, anti-vax narratives that continued into the summer of 2020 as you saw issues around migrant caravans and BLM protests in the summer. That then bled into the fall with the narratives around the stolen election. So you can't just pick apart each of these and say they're independent of each other due to the simple fact that they are not.
Right, and collectively, again, they're reflected by a mainstream of the American political population, right?
I have no basis to say what was reflected by who and how mainstream it was or wasn't.
Right, but I mean, you're an academic, you're a researcher. Obviously, politics play into that. I know that you aren't a political expert, but certainly you read. You understand that those are positions that are largely held by conservative political activists in this country.
Objection, the witness said he had no personal knowledge of that.
Sustained. He's answered the question that he doesn't know the answer to that question.
Don't you find it a little bit dangerous that if in fact these views are held by the mainstream, that what you effectively are doing is trying to marginalize them as extremist groups that should have no role in American politics?
To be abundantly clear, without question, I have never once stated that any of these views on their own is criminal, is illegal, should be outlawed in any way, shape, or form. My sole focus, my expertise here, is as it relates to how those conspiracies were weaponized by the right to draw tens of thousands of individuals to the U.S. Capitol on January 6th with the false narrative that the election was stolen and that they could somehow stop the steal by assaulting the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
And again, the tens of thousands that we're referring to were 99.5% not Oath Keepers.
They were 100% individuals who were motivated by the same conspiracies you're attempting to paint as simple, mainstream, conservative viewpoints that I'm trying to outlaw.
So
Yes.
again, in consistency with your opinion, it's your view that none of those 10,000 or so people that were protesting on the Capitol on January 6th should ever hold public office in Alaska. Given that
I have no expert or significant basis through which to opine on what any of those individuals should or shouldn't be allowed to do with the rest of their lives.
So I just want to make sure I understand your opinion properly, that all of these people that were protesting on January 6th, they were all at least part of some sort of amorphous group that was seeking to overthrow the government.
I do not believe I expressed that sentiment.
Well, I'm asking you now, because they all joined into the supposed amalgamation of conservative or extreme views, right? And they joined together in action on January 6th. So consistent with your opinion about the Oath Keepers, would you also say that they're part of some sort of amorphous group that has the same aim?
No, it's the simple fact that not everyone there was part of a group or an amorphous group or any set of phrases you'd like to use. There were a variety of groups and movements that were there, including QAnon supporters, Boogaloo movement adherents, white supremacists, anti-government extremists, Proud Boys, many of whom were there simply to protest or attend the peaceful rally that was protected by the First Amendment prior to the violence at the U.S. Capitol. Many of them then went onto restricted Capitol grounds as part of the mob that ultimately breached the Capitol. But as we've discussed here, of the 15,000 or so individuals who were on Capitol grounds, a small subset of them actually entered the Capitol, and those are the individuals that are being prosecuted, as well as the individuals who committed violence outside the Capitol, as well as the conspiracy networks of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, which the government has alleged, and in the case of the Oath Keepers, shown through evidence presented at federal trial, had pre-planned motives to go to the U.S. Capitol in furtherance of a conspiracy to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power.
The motive, again, expressed in writing numerous times by Stuart Rhodes, was invocation of the Insurrection Act and providing security on Capitol grounds. That's what he said on the website. That's what he said in his emails. Right?
That certainly does not comport with the findings in the federal trial in which he was just convicted first as conspiracy. So I will let the facts and findings of the jury in that case speak for themselves.
Oh, the jury made a comment on what he actually said to his followers?
The findings of the jury in finding that he committed a seditious conspiracy, I believe, speak for themselves in illustrating the true purpose of Stuart Rhodes and his group on that day.
And again, you're amalgamating the word seditious conspiracy with overthrow the government, even though that was never mentioned in any of the charging documents, never mentioned in the verdict form from the jury. That's just something that you're assuming.
I am not assuming. Again, I have stated several times in this testimony that the stated goal in the charging documents was to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power. Again, there was no legitimate cause. There was no legitimate way in which the Insurrection Act could be invoked that would allow the Oath Keepers to be inside the U.S. Capitol. There was no legal mechanism through which the Insurrection Act could be invoked that would somehow find the hypothetical voter fraud that to this day has never been proven to exist. And therefore, based on my expertise in relation to the Oath Keepers, in relation to January 6th, it is clear that the goal of the Oath Keepers that Stuart Rhodes brought to the U.S. Capitol in his offices as the leader, founder, and lifetime chairman of the board was to lead his group into the U.S. Capitol and direct them to forcefully breach the U.S. Capitol with the goal of framing peaceful transfer of presidential power. And as a natural extension of that, that would create a natural overthrow of the U.S. government, because there was no legal mechanism to simply delay a legitimate election. That would have resulted in the overthrow of the current U.S. government.
Mr. Lewis, hold on a second. And Mr. Miller, we have largely covered a lot of this yesterday. I understand there's nuances to the questions.
And the problem is, Judge, I'm asking him a question about communications, and then he goes off on a tangent like many experts do and spend about 10 minutes answering what wasn't actually asked.
And Mr. Miller, the way to get an answer is keep the questions short and just ask him about the communications, and then he'll answer that question.
All right, then I'll start asking the court to direct them to respond.
I
to the
will
answer
certainly
or
do
the
that.
question.
And Mr. Miller, I've done that yesterday.
Okay, very well. QAnon conspiracy theories, you say that that's something that has been embraced by Oath Keepers, and I guess specifically Stuart Rhodes. One of the QAnon conspiracy theories that you mentioned was about pedophilia, is that correct?
Yes.
And you're saying well, let me ask first, when did QAnon actually become a public entity, or when did it hit the press? When did it become a known quantity?
I believe it emerged into the mainstream around 2016. Again, I will say that my expertise here is not with QAnon, but my recollection is that 2016 is when it first began to emerge into what we would call the public consciousness.
And when you were talking about groups at the Capitol amongst the 15,000 or so who were there, you mentioned QAnon as one of those groups. QAnon is not actually a group or organization though, right?
No, sir, and I did not say it was one of the groups. I said the QAnon adherents were one of the many groups of individuals who were there.
You also mentioned anti-government extremists, but you meant that just as a general statement, right?
Yes, but I'm happy to include the Oath Keepers
No,
in that.
I understand your position on that. You made that clear. With respect to and the QAnon theory that you raised about pedophiles in government, that's when that first became a known, I guess, political view that leadership in the American government has pedophiles in it?
I can't speak to when it first became a known political view. What I can say is that when it emerged into the mainstream and when it was embraced by significant subsets of the population was 2016, around the time of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which led to a attempted shooting at, I believe it was Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington, D.C., in which a gunman believed that there were children being held in the basement of this pizza place because of a post purported to be by Q, who is a...
Okay, so I didn't ask anything about Pizzagate or a restaurant that got shot up in Washington, D.C. What I'm getting at is the QAnon views that you say have been adopted by Oath Keepers. Oath Keepers had nothing to do with that restaurant that got shot up in Washington, D.C., right?
No, I did not say that.
Okay, and the Oath Keepers never officially adopted any perspective of QAnon.
I don't know by what mechanism they would officially adopt it, but it's clear from Stuart Rhodes' communications that he, again, as the founder, leader, lifetime chairman of the board, personally embraced those views and spread them through his public and private messages across the organization.
So there's written communications from Stuart Rhodes saying that he was embracing QAnon.
There are communications that have been discussed that we referenced here at trial, where Stuart Rhodes references pedophiles in the U.S. government, which is a position that is an explicitly QAnon conspiracy theory, yes, sir.
Well, QAnon comes onto the scene in 2016. The world first learned about Epstein, clear back in 2009. In that one first, there was significant, actually newsworthy articles about the utilization of underage girls with leadership, elected leadership in the country.
I have no firsthand knowledge of what was or wasn't raised in 2009 related to Jeffrey Epstein, unfortunately.
Okay, you don't know when Jeffrey Epstein and that whole issue arose first in the public eye.
Objection, relevance.
Mr. Lewis, hold on a second. What's the...
Okay, so Judge, he's saying that Stuart Rhodes has adopted the position of QAnon. If you, or I guess what we're inquiring with this witness is the genesis. And the genesis is not QAnon or some sort of outlying, political activist group or whatever QAnon may be. It's actually sources that are available publicly. And I'd like to inquire, because he's joined this whole approach to an amalgamation of all these different things that can be used to create this picture of the Oath Keepers, and one of which this witness is doing is trying to paint it with a brush of QAnon. And he does this by linking the pedophile question into QAnon and Oath Keepers. And I'm just creating a separation with that. And I think we're entitled to do that. I mean,
I would tell you that I think it's relevant to some level of that, but we have a short trial window. And I don't find it particularly relevant to the core question that has been raised here. And so to the extent you're trying to separate it out, I'll let you know, I think you've made your point, and we can move on from it.
All right, one of the other conspiracies that you referred to that you believe has been adopted through Stuart Rhodes into the Oath Keepers because of the conflation of Oath Keepers and Stuart Rhodes is the deep state and trying to take our rights or the deep state's involvement against President Trump. Have I misstated your position on that, or is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
All right. You didn't have to see the Wall Street Journal article yesterday entitled, quote, Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020's first big lie.
Objection,
I
hearsay.
did not, unfortunately.
Hold on.
Sorry.
I'll withdraw as far as having seen the article, I'll withdraw the objection.
You're aware generally that 51 top intelligence experts signed a statement characterizing Hunter Biden's laptop in advance of the 2020 election as being a Russian hoax.
Objection,
Basically
relevant.
Russian intel.
Objection, relevance.
And Mr. Miller, what's the relevance?
Again, he's characterized conspiracy theories as not based in fact. He's paying this brush at the Oath Keepers and Stuart Rhodes as being some conspiratist organization. Part of it, and he said, let me try to get the quote as best I can. He said that the actors I think this is a quote, actors in the deep state working against Trump is part of the conspiracy. And he's characterized conspiracy as those things that aren't true. And so I'm asking him about things that are true. It's impeachment.
And I understand the road you're trying to go down, but I'm going to sustain the objection. And the reason is that the core issue that we need to focus on that's at issue in the trial, at least as far as the second part, informed by the other questions I've asked the parties, is whether or not the Oath Keepers have engaged in concrete actions to attempt to overthrow the United States government.
But you understand, Judge,
I
that the way that
understand.
he reaches that
And Mr. Miller,
opinion by amalgamation of
Mr.
all
Miller,
the
I'm in the middle of
issues.
making my ruling.
I'm sorry, Your Honor, go ahead.
Thank you. The extent that we're going to go down a road of whether QAnon or Hunter Biden's laptop or any of the other theories that have been talked about is, I find, collateral and unnecessary for the issues that we need to focus on here today. I'm, as I've said in the ruling, focused on the concrete actions that were taken. That's the unprotected speech that we need to focus on as far as the Oath Keepers took. Side opinions about whether or not there's, they're an anti-Semitic organization, whether they believe in QAnon, about Hunter Biden's laptop, about to some extent the election itself. Those don't focus on that core issue that we need to focus on today and that we need to get through in this trial. And so I'm trying to allow some level of impeachment on these issues, but we don't have time to get down into a lot of different rabbit trails on all the different conspiracy theories that have come up.
And I understand that, Judge, and I respect Your Honor's ruling, but I want to make it clear for the record that how we get to the concrete action is first through motive. And this witness has expressed that the motive of the Oath Keepers is created by this amalgamation of issues, the conspiracies, the vote integrity issues, all the other, extreme conservative positions that he characterizes the Oath Keepers by. He gets to the point of saying they want to overthrow government because of all of these things together. So in order for incitement to action to actually qualify, assuming that we get the law right on the Constitution, First Amendment, et cetera, is that you first have to have, it has to be for overthrow of government. That's the issue. Absolutely, Judge, we have to have, according to what Randburg's carved out, incitement to imminent action. But incitement to imminent action by itself doesn't do it. I mean, you can incite to imminent action to lawless behavior against law enforcement, going into the Capitol, whatever you want. But if the motive of overthrowing the government's not there, it doesn't get plaintiff to where he wants to go. In order to have the motive, you've got to get into all of these issues. This is this expert's position, that all these things together lead him to believe that the Oath Keepers is an organization that wants to overthrow the government, despite the clear language of their bylaws, despite the fact that 99% of them weren't at DC. You've got to get into all these conspiracies. That's what they've done.
And I understand, and I'm telling you that the continued impeachment on each of the conspiracies I don't find relevant, and we're going to move on. And your point is certainly preserved for the record.
Got it.
As we're at a break in the questioning, it would be helpful to have from you and then from the other parties expected timelines. We've been going for about an hour today, and so I want to keep us on track. Mr. Miller, do you have a guesstimate about how much longer your cross-examination is going to take?
Well, I was going to break down all of these different views, so that's going to accelerate my testimony considerably. Probably another hour, Judge.
Okay. Would it make sense to take a break now, or would it make sense to push through?
I would not mind having some caffeine, so.
Understood. That's a request I will certainly honor. So we'll go stand in recess for 15 minutes. We'll come back at 10:20. Leave off.
Fire Island.
Alrighty, you guys out there in Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, NorthTube land that's watching this live here at the courthouse in Palmer. If you haven't liked and shared this video, what is your problem? It is time that you get it done, and do it now. They are in recess for about the next 14 or so minutes. If you haven't liked and shared this video, please do so right now. Thank you all for being here, and I will be back in just a minute. I am going to go and take my own little small break that I desperately need to do, and we'll be back here in just a few minutes. Thank you guys again. Like and share. We'll be right back.
Okay. Yeah, I'm.
And where my backup points are, straight to in from incoming, but those are for leaving people, not here into them, so the path you have to try to turn into them is just big out of snow. So instead of doing my things, come back out of the driveway, you see it just coming with lights on both sides and off the back.
Yeah, no, it's fine. All right, thank you.
Seems like a valid question. Do you want me to get you a copy?
I got it. I just had to put energy drinks in my cups.
Okay.
I'm in a question. Are you going to stay here? Sure.
Do we need to?
I just want that watched.
Yeah. What's that? I wouldn't comment. When you guys were setting up the all of you guys came in, all of it, kind of hanging around for a month, figures, that was all very odd. And I didn't get to sign in the live stream a whole lot before I really started. So I don't know how long it lasted. I imagine once the lady comes in and sets it up, that's when it starts. And it crashed about. Don't believe that was my fault. we have access to video or tape transcripts from these engagements to use. In so many ways. Then we have each of
Who's here? Yeah, it's Kowalke, Dedugan, Miller, Eastman.
I don't think I've seen him before at some other trials related to this.
Kowalke or?
Kowalke.
No, I mean,
I haven't seen him.
Oh, okay.
And who's next to Kowalke?
Dedugan.
Okay.
If you look up David Eastman, the Palmer Courthouse, he has all his films. And that's his attorney, his main attorney. There's 3 attorneys associated with this court, but he's been the one that's been representing him.
And the state division elections, they're not here anymore.
They're,
There's that.
no, they are, they're on Zoom, but they haven't really been pulled in yet.
Okay.
This whole time they've been like, we should have nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
But she's the attorney,
She's still here.
his name is escaping me right now. She's on Zoom, yeah.
Okay. Did the judge give any direction for us this morning?
Nope, no direction. I asked if I could be in the jury, and the clerk said it was fine.
Okay.
I also asked for an audio, because I didn't have one.
Who's this guy? Uh-oh.
Oh man, I think he lives out here in the valley because I see him everywhere. And he goes to like all these meetings out here and just streams everything live. He wasn't here yesterday though.
Okay.
Politadick.
Is that his name? Dick?
I don't know.
I'll look that up.
Exactly.
I should have said that. Don't look it off. You still have the other. I should have said that. Yeah. The case is predicated on something.
Well, I've already said.
Yeah.
He's very, very rude. But he's true.
Okay.
No idea what his actual name is though.
What did you?
Thanks.
What's that?
I hate being late to this kind of thing, but.
No, I like to get some sleep every
There's
once in a
nothing
while.
wrong with it.
No, I know. People have been coming in late.
So,
They were
let me
doing
focus
something
on this,
yesterday.
Can you just move your feet for a moment? Because I can put
Is this what it started with? Was this guy testing?
Am I plugged in?
Yeah, so
I
he
wondered about
was
that.
called yesterday, because it centered around, Jon Lewis is his name, he's an expert in this.
Okay.
And then Miller, the defense started cross-examining yesterday afternoon, and so they're finishing that cross-examination now, is how it started.
Okay.
And there is, because of what, I don't know like what your guys' minutes on coverage is, but because of the split they're moving in, it might move it to virtual.
Yeah, I'm leaving,
The court.
I'm leaving at noon today.
Huh?
I'm leaving at noon today just to that before it really gets bad.
Oh, yeah, once, I mean, like, because I have to turn every single day. Once the lunch break hits, I go home and I have to watch the rest online. It's like, I can't, what do you want me to do? Like, they go until 4:30, so,
Yeah.
I wouldn't risk it either, man. I hate that highway so much.
It was bad this morning. It was like almost white out.
It's, yeah, it's super scary. It gets to a point where like you're doing it and you want to call the station and be like, no, I feel like I'm risking my life right.
My coworker hit a moose on his way home yesterday from Willow. He has dogs on Willow, dog team. So he was checking on them and moving snow. And on his way back to town, he hit a moose, totaled his car, his new car. Yeah.
And we should start normalizing snow days for adults. Yeah, really. It's like, you know, we're telling them, guys, don't drive. You don't have to. But workers go out and get footage of it, you know. What?
I know, right? We have one 4-wheel-drive car, my wife and I, and so I have to borrow the car and take her to work, take my son to school, and then come out here.
This morning?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, that's why I was like,
You didn't this much.
I just did it. Sometimes.
Oh my God.
She's kind of a stickler sometimes.
Yeah, she's not a mean bug, that's for sure. She was chatting with me.
I've had some nice interactions with her. Not for this, but you know.
Honestly, we've been doing it for 15 years, so like, we have to get close to the courtroom.
I don't know.
Or is it like, everyone hates the media situation?
I forget what the details are. It just wasn't positive.
I know.
Yeah.
Alrighty, y'all, if you're just getting here again, please remember to like and share this video if you haven't done it already. Take a moment of time to do that right now. You can find this streaming live on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and NorthTube. It will be on Rumble here within probably the next 6 hours as soon as it mitigates over to their platform. Take a moment again, like I said, to like and share this video. It's your support that made this all possible. Go to our website, Politadick.com. Click that support button. As soon as our website gets up and running by the end of the week, we're moving to a new web host. Thank you all for being here today. Like and share. They're just about ready to begin.
Just a heads up, I'm probably not gonna take an hour,
Oh,
so you might wanna get Griner ready.
how long are you thinking today?
30, maybe.
Okay.
yell into that mic.
Okay.
I am still getting a complaint that they cannot be heard. And so, yeah, I would put it directly in front of you, speak directly into the mic. Please. It's this person. Please rise.
Did you see it, everyone?
On the ring.
All right, back on the record with the parties present. Mr. Miller, are you ready to continue?
I am, Judge.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So, Mr. Lewis, I want to delve a little bit into your opinion. You have characterized the Oath Keepers as a violent extremist organization, and I think that, let me make sure I've got this right, you characterized them as an agave group, anti-government or anti-authority violent extremist organization. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And could you just briefly give us your definition of violent extremist?
Sure. Hewing largely to the government's definition, individuals who commit acts of violence or engage in plots in furtherance of a specific extremist ideology. And obviously in the case of domestic violent extremists, that's domestic ideology as opposed to the homegrown side of the ball.
And you're relying on the government's definition. Do you know when the term violent extremist came into government lexicon?
Offhand, no, I don't.
Are you aware that countering violent extremism programs were initiated by Muslim Brotherhood organizations?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Are you aware that the countering violent extremism programs were initiated by Muslim Brotherhood organizations?
I'm gonna object to relevance, because first, I don't know if the countering violence, what was the program?
Countering violent extremism.
I don't believe there was any testimony to such a program presented, and so it's unclear to me what the relevance of the question is.
Okay. Mr. Miller?
It goes directly to the underlying definition that he's using to characterize the Oath Keepers as a violent extremist organization.
And Mr. Dugan, can you make sure you speak into the microphone?
Yeah.
We're just having a hard time getting you for the record.
Okay.
And so is the purpose to address his understanding of what the term violent extremism means?
It's to gain understanding of what it means and to also gain understanding as to why and how it entered into the government lexicon and how it's now being utilized in a way to marginalize political groups, essentially.
To the extent that he's aware of what the term means or his understanding of it, that's relevant, but if he doesn't know any of the backstory on that, he can't answer to it. And then additionally, I'm wary of a significant amount of time spent on that topic as well.
So could I just ask
Yes,
one
you
final
can ask
question?
the
So
question.
you don't know anything at all about the Muslim Brotherhood or any of the type of Muslim Brotherhood affiliate groups being involved with the characterization of violent extremism in government lexicon?
I have no knowledge of the Muslim Brotherhood's involvement in countering violent extremism programs. I am aware that the countering violent extremism pilot programs that were initiated by the U.S. government in the early 2010s were run by the U.S. government.
And you know that they arose first from the Muslim Council of Britain. Is that right?
I have no knowledge of that, no.
Okay. We talked a little bit about this in your deposition about characterizations, indicators of militia, violent extremism. You're aware that FBI investigative guidelines in 2022 included indicators, the Betsy Ross flag, the Gadsden flag, imagery of the Liberty Tree, quotes from Thomas Jefferson. Are you aware of that?
I am generally aware of those indicators being listed in that document, yes.
And at least one quote from the U.S. Constitution itself, right?
I would need more information as to what you're referring to.
Okay, you don't recall in that guideline on militia violent extremism an indicator of that being the utilization of a quote from the U.S. Constitution?
I would need more clarity on what quote you're referencing to answer in the affirmative.
Taken in of itself, somebody that swears an oath to the Constitution, obviously, that being the only feature of somebody's ideology, that doesn't lead someone to be anti-authoritarian or anti-government, right?
Correct.
One of the concerns that you raised about the Oath Keepers was a March 2009 article where Stuart Rhodes published orders that we will not obey. Do you remember that discussion during your deposition?
I do, yes.
And you felt that these 10 orders reflected a conspiratorial type thought of the Oath Keepers, is that right?
Correct.
The orders that the group said they would not obey included: 1, disarm the American people.
To the best of my recollection, without referencing the list in front of me, yes, I do believe that was one of the orders.
Conducting warrantless searches of the American people, their homes, vehicles, papers, or effects.
That also, again, based on my recollection, sounds correct.
Detaining American citizens as unlawful enemy combatants.
Same answer, yes, to the best of my recollection.
Imposing martial law or a state of emergency. To enter with force into a state without the express consent and invitation of that state legislature or governor.
Same answers, yes, to the best of my recollection, those are included in that list.
Invade and subjugate any state that asserts its sovereignty and declares the national government to be in violation of the compact by which the state entered the Union.
Same answer.
Blockade American cities, thus turning them into giant concentration camps.
Same answer.
Force American citizens into any form of detention camp under any pretext.
Same answer.
Right. And so these were orders that folk of the Oath Keepers all agreed to, or is this just something that was sent out by way of an email to the membership?
As it was written, as you said, in March 2009, I believe that was before the official creation of the Oath Keepers in April of that year. I am not aware of whether every Oath Keeper who agreed to sign up had to swear that they would not obey those orders, but I recognize that it reflected the general belief of Stuart Rhodes and the individuals at the time of the formation of the Oath Keepers.
And you don't believe the federal government has the authority to do any of those things that were listed by Stuart Rhodes, right?
With the caveat that my expertise is not the federal execution of any of those activities. To the best of my knowledge, those would all be unconstitutional, yet overly broad statements. So I have the ability to really opine on that.
Now, I know that you've offered your opinion on, again, with the caveat that it's not informed by legal expertise, of what the indictments and the plea agreements reflect of the Oath Keepers that have been charged or convicted arising out of January 6th. But you're aware the FBI has found absolutely no evidence of an organized effort to overthrow the United States government on January 6th, right?
I am not aware of any such finding.
And it's your opinion that the Oath Keepers have undergone a long-term effort to undermine the Republic by their work?
Is that a quote?
I'm just asking you, let me withdraw the question. Starting in 2009, do you believe that there has been a long-term effort by the Oath Keepers to overthrow the government of the United States?
I would stop short of saying that there was a specific enumerated long-term effort that began in 2009 to explicitly overthrow the U.S. government.
It's your view that this effort started sometime in 2017 or thereafter?
I would generally state that the preparations which began and culminated in the events of January 6th would be what I would generally describe as those efforts. I did not say 2017.
So, and those efforts started, I mean, do you have a date?
I would generally assess that the plans which began in late October, early November of 2020 and culminated in the Oath Keepers' attack on the U.S. Capitol would be that time frame that I would reference when I would describe the Oath Keepers' attempts to overthrow the U.S. government.
I believe you said in your testimony yesterday that, quote, there's absolutely no evidence, end quote, of provocateurs or other individuals who were trying to incite others, perhaps at the behest of a governmental entity or somebody else, to enter the Capitol or break laws. Is that a proper characterization of your testimony?
Yes, it is.
And you're aware that the vice president of Oath Keepers, McWhorter, is an actual FBI informant?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, including the name? I don't think I caught that.
McWhorter, are you familiar with Vice President McWhorter? He was.
I'm aware that he, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yes, I'm aware that he, at one point, was an informant. To the best of my recollection, he testified at the Oath Keepers' conspiracy trial.
Well, he was subpoenaed. He never showed up because he had some sort of health issue on the way, right?
I believe that was Colonel Seaman, but I could be mixing those up. It's based on my recollection. I don't have the documents in front of me to corroborate that.
So McWhorter was part of this high-level chat group between Stuart Rhodes and other limited members of Oath Keepers in this time frame from November up until January 6th, right?
I believe he was, but again, without having the full transcripts to review in front of me, I could not confirm one way or the other.
And as an FBI informant, what's your understanding of his involvement and whatever type of incitement occurred between November and January?
There was no evidence that was presented by the U.S. government at trial to suggest that he played any role in the Oath Keepers' operational planning to travel to the U.S. Capitol or engage in seditious conspiracy on January 6th.
And of course, that's understandable given the fact that he was an informant, he was working for the government.
Is that a question?
Yeah, I'm asking you. I mean, why would you expect the government to present him as a witness if he was working for the government?
I suppose I wouldn't, and that informs my answer that I've seen no evidence presented in the trial by either side to suggest that he played an inflammatory role, or that he was a provocateur, or that he had any significant role in the Oath Keepers' operational planning and execution of those plans on January 6th.
Well, And again, I'm falling back on your review of, would you say dozens of hours of video from what happened on January 6th? Is that accurate?
Yes.
I mean, how many hours of video did you review in your work on January 6th?
I have, in the course of my research, reviewed dozens of hours of footage from arrested individuals who were inside the Capitol, CCTV footage that's been played from inside the Capitol, and other relevant sources.
And there's not a single video out there of an oath keeper inciting people to go inside the Capitol, is there?
I would argue that there is evidence of Oath Keepers encouraging other members to follow them into the Capitol. There were members of Oath Keepers on the Capitol steps yelling and shouting, both directing other individuals to go in and yelling at members of law enforcement who were on the line. I would stop short of making the assertion that there was incitement.
Right, so those that were inciting, in fact, like Ray Epps, have not been charged, have they?
I have no evidence to suggest that Ray Epps entered the Capitol, nor that he was inciting anyone. No, sir.
Wait a second.
I believe that.
Are you telling me you've not seen the videos of Ray Epps encouraging people repeatedly to go to the Capitol, to go inside the Capitol?
I believe that is a discredited conspiracy theory that has not held weight in any of the federal trials to date.
It's a discredited theory because he's not been charged.
That was not my statement. No, sir.
Okay.
And Mr. Burley, it needs to be a question.
So the question is, it was discredited in your view because he's not been charged?
That was not my statement. No, sir.
Okay. And what's your understanding?
I have observed the video of Ray Epps, who was not standing on restricted Capitol grounds. I have seen the video of him telling individuals they had to peacefully go to the Capitol. I have seen no evidence to date at any of the trials to date or in any of the plea agreements or statements of defense or defense motions that have been put forth that credibly suggest that Ray Epps played any role in the escalation to violence, that he incited individuals to attack the U.S. Capitol or any other type of activities on that day. I believe that is, as we've discussed here, a discredited conspiracy theory that has attempted to shift the blame for the events of January 6th from the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and the mob writ large onto these mystery, largely unnamed FBI informants or Antifa or mystery members of the Capitol Police.
So there's a difference between a defense and incitement by somebody else. You understand that, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
If somebody commits a crime, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because somebody else was involved in incitement that they aren't guilty of that crime.
I'm going to object to the question. I'm not sure if it calls for a legal conclusion or if it's not, then what the relevance is.
I can rephrase it, Judge. Let me just back up a little bit to a statement that you made. You said that Ray Epps said peaceably go to the Capitol. Do you remember him saying that in a video that you reviewed?
That's my recollection, yes. I will admit that I did not review that video in preparation for this case, as it is not relevant in any way, shape, or form to the activities of the Oath Keepers, because he said that near the bike racks where the initial breach was made, near a group of Proud Boys, who later made the first breach of the Capitol. He did not say that. To the best of my recollection and knowledge, that was not said within earshot of any of the Oath Keepers defendants who later breached the Capitol.
You understand he was inciting people to go to the Capitol and to go inside the Capitol. It's just you don't think he influenced the people who actually did.
I have no knowledge of whether or not he incited anyone in that part of the crowd. I have only seen the video clip of him telling people to peacefully go to the Capitol. That is the extent of my knowledge as it relates to Ray Epps within his role as someone who's been inflated by Capitol defendants to try and...
Right, Mr. Lewis, you've answered the question.
Okay. Are you familiar with somebody named Bill Dunphy that was also involved in vocally asking people to go to the Capitol, to go inside the Capitol?
The name sounds familiar, but offhand I cannot recollect who he was, what his role might have been.
Jeff Klein, same question.
Same answer.
John Brockhoff,
Same answer.
Thomas Ranstuhl,
Same answer.
Mike Blake,
Same answer.
Dave Dodenmeyer.
Same answer.
Have any of those people I just mentioned been charged or indicted in your review of the indictments arising out of January 6th?
To the best of my recollection, no. None of those names are familiar in terms of the list of capital defendants to date.
Jonathan Keener,
Same answer.
John Barnett,
Same answer.
Sam Andrews,
Same answer.
John Moore,
Same answer.
Doug Hogman,
Same answer.
George Amos Tenney,
He has been charged.
Gerald Youngers,
He has been charged.
Chad Esters,
I'm sorry, can I have that one more time?
Chad Estes, E-S-T-E-S,
I cannot recall whether or not he's been charged.
and
I don't believe he has been. Sorry,
Bobby Lee,
one more time?
Bobby Lee,
Do not recall.
Clay Parker,
Sorry?
Clay Parker,
I do not recall.
Randy Lunsford,
Do not recall him being among the list of defendants.
You said yesterday at the end of January 6th that Stuart Rhodes went back to his hotel and quote, and again, I might have one or two words wrong, so correct me if I do, realized he was getting ready to be arrested because he feared being charged with the overthrow of government, end quote. There's no written statement or even recorded statement that reflects that from him that's been introduced in any federal criminal trial. Is that right?
I believe there are a couple of minor mistakes in that statement. He went first to the hotel when he called the intermediary to President Trump to tell him to invoke the Insurrection Act. After that point, they traveled to the Olive Garden, and it was after the Olive Garden that he believed that they were about to be arrested, and then he subsequently fled the area.
But there's nothing that he said by way of chat, by way of recorded statement, that he feared being charged with the overthrow of government. Those are your words, right?
Yes, it would be fairly irresponsible, I would imagine, to make notes on a criminal conspiracy at that time.
And that, of course, plays into your whole assumption that that's what the Oath Keepers was about, overthrowing the government.
That doesn't play into my assumption. Again, the facts that were laid out voluminously inform my extra opinion on that topic. Yes, sir.
Are you aware that the West Point's Combating Terrorism Group has stated that unlike, this is a quote, unlike similar entities in the past which run afoul of federal or state statutes criminalizing private militias, the Oath Keepers and Rhodes have displayed a sharp awareness of the distinctions they must draw. Does this play into your view that Stuart Rhodes is a smart guy and he just tries to stay on the right side of the law? Or what do you think that reflects? Or do you agree with his statement?
I'm not familiar with that statement from the CTC or what the document is from or the context of that statement.
So if the Center, West Point's Combating Terrorism Center characterizes the Oath Keepers as not being a militia, you would disagree with that, given your opinion in this case, right?
I have no foundation regarding what that document is, who authored it, at what point it was authored. So I don't have the ability to offer an informed opinion on this point out of context at the time.
I want to circle back to a definition that you gave us. I'll start, and this is from yesterday's testimony. You're aware, of course, that this case has been litigated during Representative Eastman's general election
Objection.
for District 27.
Objection to the relevance.
That's the question will reflect it, Judge. I've only got 3 more questions that are related to this.
You can
The court will give me the leniency to go forward.
Overruled, you may proceed.
You're aware that this case was litigated during the general election for Representative Eastman's District 27 House race.
I am generally aware that there was a re-election during the midterms that encompassed national and state level. I cannot speak to the specific district with any knowledge, but yes.
I think your definition of patriotism yesterday was, quote, respect for the democratic process, end quote. Is it your opinion that removing Representative Eastman from office by a lawsuit is respecting that democratic process?
I don't think I have any specific foundation to make that opinion one way or the other.
I'm done, Judge, thank you. Or give me just a second to confirm the line. Yeah, I got to follow up on one question about that West Point article. Apparently, this is an article that you wrote. You don't recall the quote that I gave you earlier?
I'm sorry, is it a report from the CTC or is it an article from me in the CTC Sentinel? Those are different things. I'm sure you understand. One is part of the internal publication of the Combating Terrorism Center, and the other is a journal that is run by the Combating Terrorism Center that takes external publications.
This is a quote purportedly coming from something that you wrote for the West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. Quote, and I'll give you the whole thing. Unlike similar entities in the past which have run afoul of federal or state statutes criminalizing private militias, the Oath Keepers and Roads have displayed a sharp awareness of the distinctions they must draw to inhibit investigations into their activities. That's the full quote. Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes, that does sound like it came from the CTC Sentinel article that I published with Matthew Freiner.
All right, thank you. That's it, Judge. Thanks.
Mr. Duke, redirect?
Yes, really brief, Your Honor, thank you. Hi, good morning, Mr. Lewis, or good afternoon, where you are. I won't take much more of your time. I know you've been with us for quite a while. I want to start by asking you, do you recall yesterday questions from Mr. Miller about how many people showed up to Washington, D.C. from the Oath Keepers on January 6th?
I do, yes.
And in your work as an expert on domestic violent extremist groups, is the number of people who show up to any given mobilization a relevant factor?
It is certainly relevant when you consider the groups themselves, but I think it is important to recognize that it is not uncommon for small subsets of these groups, typically the most active, the most willing individuals, to be the ones who actually mobilize with a much larger support base, whether it's financial or ideological behind them.
And so if we put the Oath Keepers aside and look at some other domestic violent extremist groups operating in the country and their mobilizations, were the number of Oath Keepers who showed up on January 6th roughly consistent with turnout at other mobilizations?
Yes.
And what if we compare with mobilizations by homegrown extremist groups?
Also very similar. I think as a couple of examples that may be informative, when you look at the Proud Boys on January 6th, for example, they mobilized, I believe, around 80 to 100 people is my rough ballpark sitting here today. Much like the Oath Keepers, they have thousands of followers, tens of thousands of individuals who follow them on Telegram and other social media applications. They have chapters and groups across the country, and yet they only brought, again, 70 to 80, maybe 100 individuals to the U.S. Capitol. If you look at other major acts of violence, such as the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, you had groups like Rise Above Movement, League of the South, Vanguard America, National Socialist Movement, each of which could each also boast thousands, if not tens of thousands, of either active members, followers, supporters, individuals who praise the ideologies of those groups on social media. And yet the actual turnout, the loyal core of those groups that was willing to risk their body, risk criminal charges for, due to their belief in those movements, was a couple dozen. And yet we still consider those groups domestic violent extremist groups who pose a danger to national security.
And in your view, does the fact that, well, let me back up. So your testimony was that 33 Oath Keepers were charged in connection with January 6th, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there were an unknown number of other Oath Keepers who were present and who were not charged. And as a ballpark estimate, how many people would you say were present for January 6th from the Oath Keepers?
Roughly,
Ask and answered like 5 or 6 times. I think that was the quote from Mike Russ.
Well, that's true. I'm just trying to set up the next question. But
So referencing the earlier answer, go on to the next question.
Mr. Lewis, given the number of Oath Keepers who did show up on January 6th, does that lead you to believe that those individuals were acting in their own individual capacities and not as part of a group mobilization?
No, sir. Just the opposite, in fact. Due to their personal connections to Stewart Rhodes, their membership in the organization, each of those things point very clearly to the fact that they were acting on behest of Stewart Rhodes in his official capacity as in the bylaws, as the bylaws state, the founder, lifetime chairman of the board, who had veto power over any major decision the Oath Keepers made in his official capacity.
All right, and that leads me to the next line of questions about the fact that Mr. Miller asked you whether you can connect the actions and words of Stewart Rhodes with the actions and words of the Oath Keepers. Do you recall those questions from yesterday?
Yes, sir.
And why is it that you think that the actions and words of Rhodes cannot be separated from the Oath Keepers?
Yes, sir. This is quite simply because Stewart Rhodes was not acting as an individual on his own, devoid from his organization. He was not posting on a personal social media account. He was not acting independently of the Oath Keepers. It's the exact opposite. He was using the Oath Keepers website, which again was his website. He was using the Oath Keepers email address that he had to communicate with his members, including Representative Eastman. And he was distilling these orders down the chain of command of the Oath Keepers. He brought Oath Keepers to the Capitol. He did not bring a ragtag band of Proud Boys and 3%ers and QAnon supporters and other miscellaneous random individuals by chance or by luck. He brought Oath Keepers. He brought members of the Oath Keepers chapters who were willing to travel with him to the U.S. Capitol.
And you also got some questions about the bylaws of the organization. Does Rhodes have a special status in the bylaws?
Yes, according to the bylaws, he is the founder and the lifetime chairman of the board who has veto power over any decision effectively that's made. That puts him in a position of incredible authority over the operations at the national level of his group.
And I'd like you to explain kind of the division of labor between the national group and the local chapters. There were questions about the degree of autonomy that the chapters had. Can you explain to the court that division of labor, what each group or each section was responsible for?
Absolutely. So the local chapters were typically responsible for first levels of intake and recruitment of identifying individuals in their areas who would join the local oath keepers. There was, according to Rhodes' own testimony at trial, some degree of background checks that the local chapters would run, but then typically they would ask the national chapters who had more resources to run that background check. And then when you talk about the big mobilizations we see, which are few and far between from the oath keepers, the national level mobilizations were typically coordinated by Stuart Rhodes, acting as the voice of the oath keepers brand at the national level.
You testified about some local activities versus national operations. Can you give some examples of the local operations or mobilizations and compare those with the national operations?
Sure. So especially in the build-up to January 6th, and even well before that, obviously, you saw local chapters that were, again, given a degree of autonomy in terms of their local training or their local outreach or town hall meetings, as an example. But when you look at the national mobilization like January 6th, that was not something that individual chapters took upon themselves to autonomously travel to the Capitol without communicating that with Stuart Rhodes. In fact, it's just the opposite. As we discussed, you see significant outreach from Stuart Rhodes, not just blasting it out to the entire Oath Keepers membership list, but doing specific targeted outreach to North Carolina, to Florida, to Georgia, in these signal chats, communicating directly with individuals who held positions of power in those those state and local county level chapters, who he wanted to mobilize their local members to travel to the U.S. Capitol under the auspices of the Oath Keepers banner.
Who was responsible for the communication network of the Oath Keepers? Was it at the national level or the local level?
The national level, yes, sir.
And so would that include the calls to action?
Yes, the calls to action were published on the National Oath Keepers website by Stuart Rhodes and signed by Stuart Rhodes and the General Counsel for the Oath Keepers, Kelly Sorrell.
And what about the mass emails that were sent to membership? Were those done at the national level or the local level?
Yes, sir, they were sent at the national level.
And as a whole, would you say that the January 6th mobilization was organized at the national level or the local level?
It was organized at the national level. It was a national call to action that Rhodes then disseminated down himself personally. As founder, president, and lifetime chairman of the board of his organization, he used his pre-existing communication channels, created new communication channels, and disseminated his goals for his organization to his followers at the state and local level.
All right, if you can quickly turn to Exhibit 6, you were asked some questions about it on cross. This is the Rhodes email. Correct, it's the Rhodes email on November 3rd, sent to Representative Eastman and to membership as a whole. And Mr. Miller asked you if this email was calling for action at some indefinite date in the future. Do you remember that question?
I do, yes.
And he also said that it was calling for action if, quote, certain things happened. Do you remember that question?
I do, yes.
And so at some point, did the actual date for action crystallize?
Yes, after the election was decided and the Oath Keepers began to organize in November and December, they crystallized around the January 6th date as that final date, as Rhodes put it, that, quote, hard constitutional deadline, quote, by which point they must take action.
And as far as the, if certain conditions were met, what conditions would have to be met before the action would be taken?
Yes, sir. So in the minds of the Oath Keepers, that Plan A would have been the invocation of the Insurrection Act, which Rhodes saw as a cover for the activities of the Oath Keepers. And he was also, as this email and the subsequent open letters indicate, he was hoping that President Trump would mass declassify information related to pedophilia in the government, would use the military to seize voting machines, and uncover this imagined deep state that was trying to steal the election.
And you were also asked today more broadly about communications as a whole and whether they included security for events on January 6th and the Insurrection Act. Do you remember those set of questions?
I do, yes.
And were those the only two things that were included in the series of communications from Rhodes and the Oath Keepers starting on November 3rd?
No, sir. I think there's a very clear contrast to be made. So, for example, if you look at the December 12th communications that were discussed, that was a security detail, right? There was no insurrection on December 12th. There was no violent attempted overthrow of the U.S. government. The Oath Keepers went there to provide security and for Rhodes to give a speech. They had a chat around that security detail. By contrast, on January 6th, they had multiple planning calls, they had multiple communications designed around firearms that were to be brought and stored in Virginia. There were plans for civil unrest they expected would take place, and the subsequent collapse of order in that moment that would require the Oath Keepers to ferry weapons illegally into the District of Columbia, with the purpose the Oath Keepers would then be able to use those firearms. Those are not the activities of a security detail. Those are not the activities of a group that is hoping to legally and lawfully use their permits or their VIP tags to simply peacefully provide security.
And as far as the Insurrection Act goes, did the communications disseminated through the Oath Keepers recognize the possibility that President Trump might not invoke the Insurrection Act?
Yes, as they got closer to January 6th, the tone of Rhodes' messages around the Insurrection Act became more and more pessimistic. He was hopeful in this November 3rd email, for example, and in the November 9th go-to meeting. In the December 14 and 23 letters, he again implores President Trump to invoke. And as we reach January 6th, there is beginning to be a recognition by Rhodes that the act will in fact not be invoked, and they will have to take matters into their own hands.
And when Rhodes came to that recognition that Trump was not going to invoke the Insurrection Act, did he send his people home?
He did not. No, sir.
What did he do instead?
He doubled down. He directed his followers to breach the Capitol building, and even after the breach was undertaken and his supporters were driven out of the Capitol by Capitol Police, they regrouped at the Olive Garden and began discussing plans to oppose the inauguration and begin to mobilize and organize at the state and local level to violently oppose the incoming Biden administration.
You were asked some questions today about the overlap in views held by Oath Keepers versus the Republican Party at large. And for example, one of those views was anti-COVID stances. Is it your testimony that holding any of those views by themselves would constitute or would cause some organization to become a violent extremist organization?
No, sir, absolutely not.
So is something more required for those views, in addition to those views, to constitute an organization? Did I cut
Yes,
it?
sir. Yes, sir. Rhetoric by itself cannot be viewed as the only mechanism needed to view an organization as violent extremist. Again, as we've discussed here, there is nothing illegal about holding views that COVID-19 is not real or that you should not get a vaccine or wear a mask. Those are perfectly acceptable viewpoints to hold in this country. First Amendment protected activity, both in the eyes of the U.S. government and as an extremism researcher. I will happily say that these views are protected by the First Amendment and should not be viewed as the sole indicator for whether an individual or an organization is a violent extremist.
And it's a similar question, but a little bit different. If the only thing the Oath Keepers did was to hold these views, would you still have the opinion that they were trying to violently overthrow the U.S. government?
No, sir.
So what more is factoring into your opinion and would cause an organization to become a violent extremist organization?
Yes, sir. The overt acts that we've detailed here by the group, the real, clear, concrete planning and the execution of these violent activities, of the use of force at the U.S. Capitol building with the intent enumerated to oppose the peaceful transfer of presidential power, to prevent President-elect Biden from taking office and from allowing President Trump to remain in office illegally and unconstitutionally, is the core of why, in my expert opinion, the Oath Keepers engaged in this conspiracy and followed through on this conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government on January 6th.
All right, and then finally, sir, you testified today about acts of mass violence that were committed on January 6th. And I'm wondering if you can actually describe some of those acts of violence that were committed on that day.
Yes, sir. There were numerous and significant actions of violence by members of the crowd in furtherance of the assault on the U.S. Capitol. Multiple.
Mr. Lewis, hold on one second.
Sorry.
It sounds like
I think it's slightly outside the scope, but I think more importantly is a relevancy objection.
Mr. Dugan.
Well, there was testimony on cross about acts of violence that were committed on January 6th, and I just wanted the witness to explain exactly what he was referring to.
Is that in relation to the allegations involving the Oath Keepers, or is it what's the purpose of the question?
I can withdraw the question.
Okay.
And I don't have anything further.
Who's the next witness for the plaintiff?
I do have some recross, Judge.
On what subjects?
Specifically the incitement, the letter that was just brought up. I mean, that's critically important. And I'm talking about Exhibit 6.
I want just a brief recross and then a redirect on as to Exhibit 6.
Okay, so Mr. Lewis, you said that basically this Exhibit 6, which is the letter that was sent on November 3rd, was part of the incitement to action, is that correct?
I don't believe I used the phrase incitement, but as part of a broader call to action, yes, sir.
Right, and specifically in that letter itself on page 2, that's where the directive is as to what Stuart Rhodes was asking membership to do, correct?
If I could view page 2.
Right, that's fine. Go ahead and turn to it, please.
Sure. This is the page that begins with what to do today.
Correct.
Correct?
Yeah, and what
Yes.
follows underneath that heading is where Stuart Rhodes actually asked the recipients of this email to take action, right?
Yes, this is his November 3rd directive for what he thinks the Oath Keepers should do on November 3rd on Election Day. Yes, sir.
Right, to guard against fraud, as we did in 2016, correct?
That is part of the undercover members watching at polling places to guard against fraud. Yes, sir.
Number 2, watching for possible leftist violence and intimidation against conservative voters. The clear pattern of leftist violence against Trump and support makes that a necessity, correct?
That is what's listed there. Yes, sir.
And 3, today, many Oath Keepers members will also be official poll watchers, right along with other patriotic Americans.
Yes, that is what's listed there. Yes, sir.
And then he also encouraged all of this, the next paragraph, encouraged all of our members, supporters, and readers to do likewise. Assist in your local areas and keeping an eye on the election today and in days to come to keep it clean and legitimate as we can in the face of expected widespread fraud by the left and likely attempts at intimidation and violence by radical leftists, right?
That is what's described there. Yes, sir.
And then he warns that this isn't going to be over overnight, that it's going to be going on for possibly weeks. That's the next paragraph.
Yes, the one that ends with be prepared to defend against that terrorism in your neighborhood, town, county, and state. Yes, sir.
Okay. And then he says, however, it's critical that all those who will be watching out for attempted vote fraud and or intimidation be undercover and not Invisible oath keepers gear and also not be open carrying weapons. We urge other patriot leaders to do likewise. Go Gray Man today. So,
Yes, sir, that is what's listed there.
So there's no statement anywhere in this letter at all suggesting that this was part of a plan to overthrow government.
I would disagree with that assertion.
Okay, can you, I don't want to hear your opinion on a number of collected thoughts that you may have. I want you to point out the language, the specific language in this letter that you view as being reflective of the goal or reflective of part of the plan to overthrow the government.
Again, that's not my expertise. My expertise is placing this within the context that it's required, which is creating the narrative that the election is about to be stolen from the left, that the
Please
left
hold on
will
one
engage
second.
in mass
Stop
terrorism
answering.
to achieve their goals. That's setting the stage
Can you hear us?
for, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it sounds like, I think our bandwidth is having some issues, and so it sounds like you're having a hard time. So the question that Mr. Miller has asked you is just, is there a specific line in this email that would qualify as a, what's the term that
Well,
you're?
there's going to be two questions. The first is reflective of a goal or plan to overthrow the government.
Right. Is there a line that you can point to?
No, sir.
Right.
And then the second is there a line that's inciting any type of lawless behavior?
No, sir.
And of course, then there's not also a line inciting behavior to overthrow the government, right?
Not in this letter, no, sir.
And then the last question, just relating, Judge, if you'll give me a little bit of liberality, just one more question outside of this. Is David Eastman one of Stuart Rhodes' followers?
Objection, Your Honor, it's totally outside the scope of the
And
reader.
I'll let you redirect on this, but I'll add a question.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Is Representative David Eastman one of Stuart Rhodes' followers?
As a member of the Oath Keepers, as a active lifetime member of the Oath Keepers, I would place him along with all other Oath Keepers unless explicitly stated otherwise, as a follower of Stuart Rhodes, who is the active founder, president, lifetime chairman of the board of the Oath Keepers.
On the basis that he's given money in 2009 and 2010 to Oath Keepers. Anything else?
On the basis of his active lifetime membership and continued support for the Oath Keepers organization. Yes, sir.
That's it, Judge.
Mr. Dedukian?
I just have maybe one question. Mr. Lewis, is the November 3rd email the only communication that is what you're basing your opinion on in this case?
No, sir. It is one of many public documents and statements made by Stuart Rhodes, which, taken as a whole, reflect a clear conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government by force.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
All right, any reason we shouldn't excuse Mr. Lewis at this point? Great. All right, Mr. Lewis, thank you very much. You're excused.
Thank you.
Mr. Dedukian, who's the next plaintiff's witness?
Matthew Kreiner.
Is he
I believe he
available?
should be on the waiting room.
All right, he's connecting right now. We've been going, we're going to be hitting about an hour. My intent's to find a natural stopping spot sometime around noon, around that time to give the parties a chance to get lunch. Obviously, we want to be respectful of the witness's schedule as well, but that's generally time frame wise what we're going to be shooting for.
Sounds good, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, sorry about I didn't see him there. All right, Mr. Kreiner, can you hear us?
Yes, Your Honor, I can.
All right, where are you joining us from?
My home in Washington, D.C.
All right, and are you at this point able to have a conversation with us without being interrupted?
Yes,
All right, so please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the statements you will provide in today's hearing are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, please put your hand down, and then tell us both your first and your last name and spell both for the record, please.
Matthew Kreiner, Matthew
All right, Mr. Dedukian, you may inquire.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Kreiner. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Let me know if at any point you don't hear me. I think there's been some problems with audio, and if any part of my question cuts out, let me know and don't answer, okay?
Understood.
And Judge, just for the record, the continuing objection to this testimony, and I would add also in view of Your Honor's statement regarding incitement, the relevance, an additional relevancy objection to this testimony.
All right. The continuing objection is noted for the record, so ruled, we can continue.
Thank you. Mr. Kreiner, how are you currently employed?
I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at Middlebury Institute for International Security.
And do you sometimes refer to that as CTEC?
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about CTEC?
Yes. CTC, or CTEC, a little easier to say, is a research center housed out of the Middlebury Institute of International Security Studies. It's been around for approximately 4 years now. We focus on violent extremism and, I'm sorry, there's a lot of feedback out of the one thing that's kind of distracting.
We heard a little bit of feedback. Unfortunately, it's been happening with some of our Zoom witnesses. It wasn't that bad actually this morning. Madam Clerk, are we?
Anything from the record, all of my mechanisms are shut off. Do we have?
It's just coming out of the Palmer Courtroom 7. If we can mute the mic on it if it's not necessary.
Are you able to?
Think that's better? Yes, much better. Thank you. Sorry about that. As I was saying, it's a research center that's been around for approximately 4 years now, and it focuses on various different components of violent extremism and terrorism research. And we are engaged in evaluating domestic, transnational, and multiple ideological frameworks, as well as other challenges and emerging threats from digital spaces, technological advancements, etc.
How long have you been at CTEC?
I lost you, Gordon.
How long have you been at CTEC?
No, that's our courtroom audio.
All right. There's another one that says courtroom Palmer, courtroom 7.
That one's shut off altogether.
Do you think it's because of the double mics?
No, I
Mr.
don't
Kreiner,
hear
can you
any
hold on?
feedback. It's on the other end of, he can hear us now,
Can you hear us now, Mr. Kreiner?
Yes.
and you've got feedback.
Are you getting feedback based on what you're hearing right now?
Generally, it's just when I talk.
Okay. And Mr. Dedukian, are you able to hear Mr. Dedukian?
Can you hear me when I say that?
Yes.
And so, Mr. Kreiner, maybe if you could turn your microphone down just a little bit, I don't know if that's part of it, but we can hear you fine. You're loud enough for us to hear.
I will attempt to do that, yes. All right, can you still hear me?
I can hear you
Yeah.
fine.
Do you want me to proceed? Or
Perfect.
And are you getting feedback when you talk? All right, you can proceed.
Thank you, Judge. I think my last question was, how long have you been at CTEC?
I've been at CTEC in just over 1 year. It's December now, so I think it's a year and a month and a half.
Can you tell us about your responsibilities as a senior research scholar there?
Yes, my role is to oversee the domestic violent extremism vertical, the accelerationism research, our work in partnerships with tech sector and government entities. I'm also charged with overseeing all of our emerging threats in partnership with data providers.
And just at the outset, I want us to define some terms so that everyone is on the same page. So when you say domestic violent extremism, what are you referring to exactly?
So when I use the term domestic violent extremism, what I'm talking about is individuals that are based in the United States, and that's the domestic component. Violent extremist refers to individuals who believe violence is a component, necessary component, of their actions to achieve ideological or politically extreme goals, and that's the extremism component.
And you also mentioned accelerationism, is that right?
That's correct.
And can you define that term?
Yes, accelerationism is the use of tactics and strategies meant to exploit latent social divisions within society for the purposes of violently hastening the collapse of society.
Okay, and in your work, do you look, have you studied both domestic and international organizations, or are you focused more on one or the other?
So throughout my career, I've focused on both. Within the last few years, I've been mostly focused on domestic entities, though there's always a component of transnational within that at this point in time. So the real answer there is that I'm consistently looking at domestic and transnational components of extremism.
Among the domestic groups that you studied, can you tell us what they are?
I can start with a categorization of them. We look at groups that are ideologically oriented towards fascistic views, anti-Semitic views. We look at those that are militia in orientation or anti-government, anti-authority. We've also looked at far left organizations that can classified as Marxist or communist in nature. We've also evaluated anarchist associations and groups. And we often will look at emerging groups like the Boogaloo that will often flit across many different classification of systems.
And in your work, and we're going to talk about your prior employment in a second, so I'm going to ask you the question as, in your work as a whole, have you looked at the Oath Keepers organization?
Yes.
And amongst the various types of entities that you described, which one would you categorize them in?
Oath Keepers would fall under our anti-government, anti-authority bucket, as well as the far-right bucket.
Do you also consult for the U.S. State Department?
Yes.
And can you tell us what you consult with them on?
Yes, so I've provided briefings and informational sessions with the State Department, particularly their counterterrorism division, looking at the threat of emerging violent extremist networks and actors, but specifically the accelerationism actors and neo-fascists that I spoke about earlier.
And are you consulting with them on such organizations in other countries or the ones that are operating in the U.S.?
Well, their purview is transnational or outside the U.S. boundaries. That's predominantly we've talked about, though, as I mentioned at the outset, it's very hard to distinguish some of these actors, and there sometimes is overlap with domestic entities in terms of what we talk about.
And have you also collaborated with the Department of Justice on criminal prosecutions?
I have provided analysis to the Department of Justice on various investigations they've conducted in the past.
And were any of those investigations related to the events of January 6, 2021?
Yes.
Before you went to CTEC, did you work in the same field for a different organization?
In the same field, yes, in the sense that it's research and analysis. That entity was not exclusively associated with looking at violent extremism. There was a much broader remit for that entity. So I would say my role was split across there in terms of what I focused on. I did criminality investigation support as well as violent extremism investigation support.
And so can you tell the court what organization you worked at before CTEC?
Yes, it was Thomson Reuters Special Services.
And you mentioned some of your duties at Thomson Reuters. I didn't catch them when I was taking down notes. So you said what were the two main kinds of work that you did at Thomson Reuters?
Support for criminal investigations writ large and support for violent extremism investigations.
And in your work, have you also done threat assessments for violent extremist groups?
Yes, on a regular basis.
Do you do that at CTEC?
Yes.
And did you also do that in your prior employment at Thomson Reuters?
Yes.
Do you have any other work experience in the field of domestic violence extremism?
Yes, I was an analyst at Balance Global for a short period of time, and prior to that, I've worked in at the Israeli government's consular attaché office in Atlanta, Georgia, where I supported political liaison activities as well as interfacing with the security department there on active threats that were posed at the facility and diplomats that were there.
And
Go
ahead.
I was going to say, I also worked at Uber's Global Security Center, where I was a program manager and a senior intelligence analyst, doing much of the same, but for the private sector aspect of the threats that would emerge. And sometimes I would intersect with violent extremist organizations in the United States and elsewhere.
Can you tell us about your educational background?
Yeah, absolutely. My undergrad was at Kennesaw State University. It was an international affairs degree where I focused on geopolitical power dynamics and global terrorism challenges. My master's degree was from the IDC Herzliya, now known as Reichman University, where I focused on government and terrorism policy. That was a PhD track program where I did a lot of methodology and ethics review and other sorts of training in terms of how to conduct research on terroristic and violent extremist actors.
Have you published at all?
Yes, I have published quite a bit.
Can you tell us the subjects on which you've published?
Absolutely, yes. The subjects I've published on have been violent extremist actors, both domestic and international, far-right extremism, radicalization, various other politically oriented things in terms of dynamics within political systems that lead to whether violent extremist outcomes or conspiracy theories, and how those mobilize to violence, as well as the Oath Keepers specifically, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Movement, and a few other entities like Adamov and Division of the Base.
Right, so I was going to ask you specifically about the Oath Keepers. How many articles have you published on the Oath Keepers?
I don't recall the exact number off the top of my head, but it's between 3 and 6, I think.
Okay, and did you author one article in the CTC Sentinel about the Oath Keepers?
Yes, I co-authored that with Jon Lewis.
And what was that article about?
About the Oath Keepers organization, its origins, history, its offline activities, online activities, and the road of its walking of violence towards the January 6th insurrection, and then their role on that day, and some of the legal elements of that organization's involvement with January 6th.
And can you say where that was what publication it was printed in?
The CTC Sentinel.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that publication? Like the CTC
yes, so sorry.
I was just going to say, the publication, I mean just that journal, the CTC Sentinel.
Yes, so the CTC Sentinel is a peer-reviewed journal, not in the sense of a full academic journal, but there are peer reviews with a managing editor. It's housed at the West Point Academy, and it is a sort of top-tier, non-academic, in the sense of gated access place for these types of articles to be published.
Okay, and when you say these types, are you referring, well, can you explain that?
Yes, so it's a less oriented and more analysis and explanatory style writing, so it's less about academic frameworks and theory, and it's much more about what are the practical implications of these types of developments in the world, and what does it mean for practitioners and people that read this outlet to understand the dynamics that which we're discussing as authors.
And have you published other articles with Jon Lewis?
I have, yes.
Is he regarded as an expert in the field of domestic violent extremism?
I would say so, yes.
Have you ever testified in court before?
No, I have not.
Have you ever testified in a legislative hearing?
Yes.
Can you tell us on what occasions you did that?
Yes, I was invited before the Alaska legislature in February of this year to discuss the organization of the Oath Keepers.
Was that, did you provide verbal testimony or was it in writing?
It was a verbal testimony with a presentation via PowerPoint. So a little bit of both.
Okay, and have you also given testimony either verbally or in writing to Congress?
I have given testimony via writing to congressional committees, yes, to the January 6th Select Committee.
And how many statements have you provided to the January 6th committee?
I led two statements draftings, one where I was a direct co-author and one where I was one of multiple co-authors at the CTEC Research Center. Both focused on the role of malicious and conspiracy theories as it pertains to January 6th and how individuals came to leverage violence and sought to interrupt the presidential transfer of power that day.
Did either of the statements you provided to Congress discuss the role of the Oath Keepers in the January 6 events?
Yes, both.
And I don't recall if I asked you specifically about your Alaska testimony. Did you discuss the role of the Oath Keepers in that testimony?
Yes, I did.
If I were to ask you to just sum up your expertise in a few sentences, how would you do it?
I would say that my expertise is understanding and evaluating individuals and networks and groups related to violent extremist and terroristic networks and entities. I've leveraged multiple approaches to do so, which is threat assessment, academic research, and experience as a practitioner as an intelligence analyst.
And to what extent have you studied the Oath Keepers organization in your career?
I would say that it's been a fairly persistent subject of analysis for the past 3 to 4 years. And then prior to that, it's been off and on again based on the actions they've taken offline that were concerning in terms of their intimidation and use of violence. And prior to that, it was a passing interest as an undergraduate student.
Okay. Are you familiar with the entire history of the organization from its founding to the present time?
I am, yes.
And have you specifically researched the role of the Oath Keepers in the January 6th insurrection?
Yes.
And without listing every article or every piece of information that you considered, can you generally describe the categories of information about the Oath Keepers that you've looked at?
Yes, so I've looked at primary data related to the organization, which would be statements made by the leadership, the organization itself, associated members, individuals that claim association and sympathy with the organization. Those primary types of documentation can include text transcriptions from YouTube videos, other social media type content, as well as the website, archives of the website, and archives of their statements and activities collected by other researchers. Outside of that, I've looked at public record reporting, so journalism, government documents, and other such publicly available content. And then I've also evaluated the Oath Keepers data leak that came from their member rolls, which is also obtained publicly from the internet. I didn't have special access to it. I just received it as part of being on the internet. and which I believe is still publicly available. I've also looked at all the secondary analysis and reporting on that data as well.
And have you developed or compiled, I should say, a private repository of social media postings by the Oath Keepers?
I do retain information and data of that nature from all research and investigations that I've done. To the extent I would say a compiled data set, it's not very robust from my personal standpoint, but it does have a significant amount of secondary resources compiled into lists of documents as well as social media activity, yes.
And do you have access to other repositories of social media activity by the Oath Keepers?
Yes, they're publicly available ones through archive.org from their official accounts and individuals, as well as some of the transcriptions that are available through Dr. Sam Jackson's GitHub account that are publicly available for anybody to access.
And you were asked to provide an opinion in connection with this case, correct?
That's correct.
What were you asked to provide an opinion on?
I was asked to provide an opinion on whether the Oath Keepers organization is an active organization and was striving for the disruption of the U.S. government's proceedings on January 6th and the role that they had that day.
All right, do you have an opinion on whether the Oath Keepers is an organization that seeks to violently overthrow the U.S. government with concrete action?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? The sound cut out a little bit.
Sorry. Do you have an opinion on whether the Oath Keepers is an organization that advocates the overthrow of the U.S. government with concrete action?
Yes, my expert opinion is that the Oath Keepers has consistently displayed and spoken to a desire to see the U.S. government in certain conditions removed with the goal of having their personal political views replace the system that is currently in place.
And what are those certain conditions?
So it's a rotating cast of conditions. They're frustratingly inconsistent on what they believe to be those conditions. So what we can typically say is that they have a view that the U.S. government is proactively engaged in degrading the American natural rights, that they are taking away things such as access to firearms, and they also sometimes use conspiracy theories to find new ways to creatively assign blame to the U.S. government for their supposed loss of rights and access to either power sharing. And typically what I would say is that the conditions they're talking about are often rooted in either misinformation or outright conspiratorial beliefs. And they will have shifted since 2016 approximately from believing the government would launch some sort of war or violence against the American populace into they must take concrete steps now to resist the government. And at times that means mobilizing against federal law enforcement officers at federal lands, at individuals' properties such as the Bundy Ranch. The January 6th example is a good one where they felt the need to show up at the U.S. Capitol and then insert themselves across the boundaries and into the Capitol building itself as a means of displaying their desire to meet a supposed and alleged government conspiracy to remove President Trump from office.
And Judge, if I could, now that we've heard kind of the background of what this is being offered for, I need to add to my objections cumulative 403.
Your Honor, first of all, under the evidence rules, we could theoretically offer up to 3 witnesses on any issue, which we're not doing. And as I stated in my opening, we're going to try our best not to accumulate or duplicate the testimony. Mr. Kreiner is going to take the founding of the organization until approximately the 2020 election, and we just heard about actions and events after that date. So there will be, of course, a little bit of duplication, but I will try my best not to duplicate testimony.
All right, so with that explanation, the objection's over.
Mr. Kreiner, in addition to just advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government, Have the Oath Keepers taken concrete action or actual action to overthrow the U.S. government?
So in my professional estimation, I would say that throughout their history, they've taken direct action against the U.S. government multiple times. That would have not necessarily account to overthrowing it in the historical context, but leads to our understanding of what their intentions were on January 6th, which strikes directly at the heart of American democratic processes when they sought to disrupt the peaceful transition of power between one president and another, which in my estimation is tantamount and equivalent of overthrowing by virtue of just preventing the peaceful transition which is required by law.
And to follow up on that, and limiting my question to the events of January 6th, did the Oath Keepers take actions on that day to prevent the transfer of presidential power?
Yes, so multiple members of the Oath Keepers were present at the Capitol and inserted themselves into a stack formation that moved into the Capitol and sought out individuals in Congress with the express intent of disrupting those political processes. And by virtue that is, or by definition, that is a physical use of their identity and their personhood to concretely stop that transition.
All right, so let's back up now, and I want to start with the founding of the organization. Can you tell us when the organization, the Oath Keepers, was created?
Yes, it was founded in 2009.
And by whom?
Stuart Rhodes.
Does the organization have a legal status?
Can you repeat that?
Is the organization a legal entity, to your knowledge?
So to my knowledge, they are a legal entity registered in Nevada. The last public record that I was able to see was filed in 2011, and I don't have any further updates on their legal documentation.
Do you have any information to suggest that the organization has been dissolved?
I do not know.
Well, it's been answered, but again, I mean, the same sort of objection as before, he's not been introduced to the legal expert with any authority and bylaws and whether or not an entity is a lawful organization. So I object, that's not part of the expertise that he testified that he was going to be offering his opinion through.
Can I lay additional foundation?
Yes.
Mr. Kreiner, you testified before that in your career, part of your job duties have included conducting threat assessments, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And is part of doing a threat assessment trying to determine the current status of an organization?
Yes.
And what sorts of data points do you look at in trying to determine the current status of an organization?
So we take into account in our field multiple different avenues of information. One is publicly available public records. So we look at public records that intersect with organizations that file as tax exempt or look for charitable status, as well as just wanting to be considered as maybe a for-profit entity. This is not unheard of. We also look at statements from the organization, the charters if they exist, or the bylaws in this case with the Oath Keepers, and statements from the leadership and individuals that hold leadership roles throughout the history of the organization.
And were you asked in this case to provide an opinion on whether the Oath Keepers is still an active organization?
Yes.
And what did you conclude?
My conclusion, based on evaluating all the factors, that it's still an active organization, and there's been no evidence to suggest otherwise.
All right.
I don't know if we have
Hold
a
on one
ruling
second.
that, Judge.
All right, so as far as the earlier objection, it is, his testimony to my mind is not being offered to say a legal opinion about whether they're active or not. He's testifying as to the usual sources of information that he's looked at as part of his regular work. Essentially, he's more of a fact witness on that point, that he's trained to look for this information. So I'm allowing the testimony for that purpose, but the ultimate legal significance of whether the Oath Keepers still exist or not, that's a legal question that I'm gonna have to make. I also wanted to interrupt because I want to spend a little more time making sure we get a good record. Mr. Kreiner, it looks like before you were using it sounded like a different microphone. It's a little bit harder to understand you with your current setup? Would it be tough to go back to whatever it was you were doing a little bit earlier?
How about now?
That's better on our end.
Okay. Yeah, it was just the feedback was much worse on the headphones, but that's fine. I'll soldier through.
I appreciate that. It's helpful on our end. It's a better connection for us.
Absolutely.
All right, Mr. Duke.
So, Mr. Kreiner, if you were asked to do a threat assessment on the Oath Keepers right now, would your conclusion be that it is an active organization?
Yes, I would say that the organization as a whole still is active. There are members that are still very much present within society and have not been provided with any sort of statement of dissolution as we've seen with other extremist organizations elsewhere. A really good example of this is the Adamawa Division dissolution a few years back, where James Mason, specifically as the leader of the entity and in coordination with the operators of the network, released a statement saying that they are no longer active and that anything associated with that name afterwards would be considered illegitimate in their minds. As the founders and ideologues of that group, we take that as it is, because this is them saying we are no longer in charge. But it's a trust and verify. We look for other points of information to determine if that's smoke and mirrors. As of this day, we've seen no such statement, no such smoke and mirrors from the organization of the Oath Keepers. There is, in fact, no indication that the leadership or Stuart Rhodes himself or anyone that had temporarily held the reins of the organization had any desire at all to fold the organization and did not say as such. So from where I sit as an expert in this field, there is no reason to believe that the organization is not active practically and in any other sense.
Are there any examples of other organizations or potentially chapters, local chapters, that did issue public statements after January 6th?
Yes, and in fact, multiple chapters of the Oath Keepers organization stepped away from the national apparatus after January 6th. There may have been additional factors as to why they chose to do that and the timing, but the fact of the matter is they chose to do so. There have been other organizations, such as the 3%er movement, that formally dissolved after January 6th. Again, there are additional factors at play, such as the Canadian government's listing of the organization as a terrorist entity following their involvement in January 6th and their past history of violent extremist activities, such as bomb plots and other type of terroristic behavior.
Okay. Can you tell us about the derivation of the name of the Oath Keepers?
Yes, so from my understanding of the organization, the name is derived from the oath that all individuals that serve in a public servant capacity or military and law enforcement capacity take. And therefore they kept the name Oath Keepers as an ode to that.
To your knowledge, is there a peculiar way in which the Oath Keepers interpret that oath?
I would say yes, that the notion of the oath is uniquely interpreted by the Oath Keepers, particularly because the vast majority of individuals that are members of the organization aren't active duty, aren't currently holding those roles. And that leads to a two-part issue in terms of what that oath means and the significance of taking that oath, again, under the auspices of the organization of the Oath Keepers. First, the idea that when one is no longer in active service where that oath was taken, the continuation of that oath in a separate organization that holds anti-government, anti-authority extremist views really brings down concerns about the nature in which they think that oath can be followed through on. In many ways, that leads towards a perception that they have the right to make determinations on what is and isn't lawful, what is and isn't constitutional, taking it out of the context of the balance of power system that we hold in this country, which means that they're often engaged in extrajudicial or extra-legal activity that's channeled into a paramilitary notion of the organization. That isn't always the case, but the reality is that enough of the membership and enough of the organization's beliefs and statements track along with that to allow us to say that they are perverting the notion of the oath in order to express their own personal political views in a manner that allows them to exert it over others, often armed and often at times when they're expressing their own First Amendment or other rights. The second component of that is that when individuals are actively serving in those roles where they've taken an oath, it creates a dualistic notion of loyalty. In this sense that if one's position requires you to take an oath and you are meant to follow through on that oath in that capacity, but then you state, I'm taking my duties of the oath keepers seriously, you're now saying that these two things are equal, and it raises questions as to which one has primacy in that individual's worldview and sense of duty. It very much can raise the question of individuals in the military and law enforcement and other positions where they can choose between life and death of another, that they may choose to do so not in the public servant capacity in which they took the oath originally, but in their own or an extrajudicial or an extra legal entity's views, and that can create severe consequences within a liberal democratic system.
During part of your answer, there was a momentary cutout of the audio, so I just want to fix the record on that. Did you say there was a dualistic notion of loyalty, or what were your exact words?
Yes.
You have access to all of the exhibits in the case, right?
Yes, I do.
Can I have you pull up Exhibit T, which is one of the defendant's exhibits?
Yes. 1 second. Okay, I have it here in front of me.
Do you generally recognize the document of Exhibit T?
Yes, I do.
I want to ask you about, well, first of all, can you tell us what it is?
From what I recognize of it, it looks to be their website's About Me page.
Okay. I want to ask you specifically about one line in here where it says, oath keepers declare that they will not obey unconstitutional orders. And you referred to that before. Can you tell us how is it that the oath keepers determine whether an order is unconstitutional or not?
Yes, so this is actually the grand question about the oath keepers and their expression of their political beliefs through organizing under the banner of holding a constitutional oath, right? And that is that it's very difficult to actually ascertain how they make the determination of what is and isn't constitutional. Short of having a long drawn-out conversation or an on-the-record statement from those individuals, we're consigned to looking at what it is they make in statements of public records, such as blog posts, statements, and speeches. And what that leads us to understand as experts and researchers in this space, myself included, is that these individuals are picking and choosing what they believe to be personally constitutional. And even though they may cite certain legal statutes or certain philosophical notions from documents written by our founding fathers, ultimately what they're doing is a personalized decision and then asserting that as truth.
Besides the declaration not to obey unconstitutional orders, can you tell us some of the other central tenets of the organization?
Yes, so some of the other central tenets of the Oath Keepers is that they broadly view themselves as resisting to tyranny. They believe themselves to be a so-called guardian of the Republic, true patriots of the Constitution. In many ways, we can sort of define this as individuals that are constitutionalists. So they view the Constitution as the primary document of the United States and anything else as ancillary or unnecessary or to be disregarded. So that's one area. A second component of that is a fierce protection of Second Amendment rights. So they're very staunch supporters of access to firearms and against any abrogation of that access from a legal or from a policy standpoint. There are other components of it in terms of their sort of perception that as members of a protective class with a sense of law enforcement service or military service, that they are looking out for the rest of the United States citizenry, and therefore they should act and engage in a way that protects those persons from the tyranny or supposed tyranny of the U.S. government.
Now, you mentioned something that caught my ear, which is that they consider themselves to be, quote, guardians of the Republic. Isn't that at odds with your statement that they are anti-government?
Yes, it is ultimately a sort of oxymoronic statement for them to make. In its essence, they're trying to use the perversion, they're perverting their own patriotic stance and notions of what it means to be adherent to the Constitution because they're engaging in personalized interpretations of what is and isn't lawful and what isn't constitutional. And as such, they're portraying themselves as the only arbiter of that and willing to use violence in order to protect it. And thus we get to the logical conclusion in their minds, Stuart Rhodes's minds when he founded the organization, that this means they are guarding the Republic from enemies, and that's part of the oath that they claim to be upholding.
And who are the enemies that they're guarding the Republic from?
Oh, apologies. So the enemies sort of rotate, it depends. In big terms, it's tyrannical forces, which can spin out into multiple different areas, such as conspiracy theories about the United Nations, about communists, about socialists. Generally speaking, it's these abstract notions of anything that might pervert their understanding of what American liberal democracy or constitutional republic should be. And that allows them to rotate through what that is. At times, it's meant that they say there's a deep state working against the American people, that it's secretly controlling activity that happens and taking the power of the vote away from the American people. At other times, they'll label that to specific organizations or political philosophies or factions, such as the Democratic Party, anti-fascist activists, otherwise known as Antifa. Black Lives Matter has been targeted this way. Generally speaking, it's again a rotating cast of individuals and actor networks in their minds that are again taking away what they think are the proper governance structures.
What are the views of the organization on the federal government?
At its simplest terms, they view the federal government as a bloated behemoth, overly bureaucratic, and far beyond what it was intended to be from a fundamentalist view of the drafting of the U.S. Constitution and U.S. government construction. In terms of, as an expert in this space, I would say that their views of it are one that is, they don't view it as legitimate. They often view it as an enemy. They see it as a combatant in an ongoing civil war or an imminent civil war as the aggressor in that space. They do not see the federal government as properly conducting affairs and therefore a legitimate target for aggressive or even violent conduct at times to push back on what they view to be improper jurisprudence in certain conditions or improper policies that they believe are not constitutional.
And Judge, if I could interject again, and I'm not trying to aggravate the court with this, but again, we're getting into this list of aggregated acts or thoughts and beliefs of the Oath Keepers, including the deep state and everything else, that you shut down on me in cross-examination saying that it wasn't relevant because we're looking at incitement. So if we're going to permit this testimony on what the Oath Keepers believe, then I should be entitled to go into an inquiry as to underlying basis for that. They're saying it's conspiracy, has no basis in fact, it's fabricated, it's part of the reason that we're evaluating, or that these experts are evaluating the Oath Keepers as being an anti-government, anti-authoritarian group that wants to overthrow the government. So I think we have to allow Representative Eastman's case to inquire into, not his case, but in his cross, inquire into those underlying facts, alleged facts that Mr. Kleiner is expressing in his testimony now.
Mr. Dickey?
Yes, Your Honor, we're providing this testimony for the limited purpose of showing what they believe. We're not here to try the truth or falsity of what they believe. I think that's besides the point. What they believe informs the actions that they subsequently took. It doesn't matter if they were right or not from our perspective. And so I think you're right that while there might be some collateral relevance, it's just completely outweighed by the limited amount of time that we have, and they're so far afield from the core issue that I would say it's irrelevant.
Well, I
Or
was-
under 403 should be precluded.
And so the way I'm understanding though, Mr. Miller's objection is that the more time that we spend on that context, the more it starts to become something that becomes fair cross-examination, or at least, I don't want to say opens the door, but I agree with the overall statement that you're making as far as the core questions before the court. The issues are whether or not, just focused on the oath keepers at least, whether or not the oath keepers engaged in words or conduct that either incited the violent overthrow of the government or actually engaged in the violent overthrow of the government. I would agree with your statement that I don't find motives or why they did that, or the reason being true, factual or not factual, particularly relevant to, it's viewpoint neutral, essentially. It doesn't matter why they did it. It's whether or not they engaged in the conduct and what that conduct was.
But again, Judge, it's critical that the motive be, again, we're getting to, at least in the constitutional provision, determining on, depending on how Your Honor interprets that provision with the limits that the federal constitution, the state constitution, First Amendment applies to that. If the acts that are occurring, I mean, let's just grant, although we strongly dispute this, that there was incitement to lawless action that falls outside of the First Amendment. But let's say that there's some sort of incitement to the membership of lawless action. It still has to meet the second issue, and that is it's incitement to lawless action to overthrow the government. And so the motive counts, and what they're doing is they're providing these conspiracy theories, which they've described as false. This is part of their amalgamation of all the bad beliefs and views that the Oath Keepers have, to say that this is really a group that believes all these bad things, so therefore they want to overthrow the government. They can't point to anything specifically in the writings. Nowhere has Stuart Rhodes said in the emails to the group that he wants to overthrow the government. I mean, the email they pointed to initially under Mr. Lewis's testimony was presented for that fact. It turns out there's nothing in that email that says anything about the overthrow of government. The only way they can get there is through this aggregation, this amalgamation of the different views that they say the Oath Keepers embrace, and therefore really their objective is to overthrow the government. Because they've got to get to that in order to join, if they actually do prove the incitement, to that underlying motive of overthrow the government. So I think...
And Mr. Miller, where I disagree with you on that is the fact that it's a motive. Instead of looking to the subjective intent of the person, I agree that there's some level of looking to the means, but the real focus there is on the conduct and the speech of what is going on at the time. And what I heard from Mr. Lewis when he was testifying was that the actual reasons that were given themselves were not what he was focusing his opinion on. Instead, it was on the actions that were taken on January 6th. That's the core of what the plaintiff's case is focused on. And so to the extent that we're going to talk about various motivations behind the Oath Keepers, I find it generally helpful context, but again, it's not relevant to the key questions before the court. So your objection is certainly preserved.
And Judge, with all due respect, again, I'm not trying to be argumentative with the court, but Article 4, Section 2 states advocates. That's the operational word. Now, we've got to read into the context of that incitement. But advocates does reflect what they are doing it for. So it does get to motive. It gets to the underlying context of what's going on. And that's why I think it's so important, for plaintiff's case, for them to present all this information to try to create this boogeyman out of the 38,000 members of the Oath Keepers that are really out there because of all these bad views that they have, wanting to overthrow government. Because that is the operational aspect of Article 12, Section 4. You have to advocate for it. It's not just incitement. And so that does mean, what are they advocating for? It reflects that underlying motivation. So again, I respect Your Honor's ruling on this and certainly will comply with that in my questioning, but for the record, I just wanted to make that clear.
Understood. Thank you.
Your Honor, and I take your point about, not focusing extensively on it, and we're at a natural breaking point. I was going to move on anyway. I am going to note for the record a continuing objection that every objection is leading to prolonged argument that has nothing to do with the objection, and I just want that noted.
I take it, at this point, I don't think that in this instance, Mr. Miller's response to the courtier's argument was overlong. This is an important issue, and I think he was making a record here. But other times we've had extended conversations, and so for what it's worth, I appreciate us all moving forward on the case. You know, we all recognize the timeframes on this. So we are at a natural breaking point. Is the request still for about an hour for the parties to be able to functionally get some food and keep going?
That's fine, Judge.
Okay, so I'll cut you 5 minutes short. If we come back at 1 o'clock, that's our goal for getting started. So 1 o'clock, other than that, we can stand and recess. I don't want you.
And courtroom's gonna be shut up, locked.
Yes. Our staff all stay.
Okay, folks, I'm going to be shutting down this broadcast here in just a second, and don't forget to make sure to like and share what you have seen here today. They're kind of an eventful morning, not quite as good as what yesterday was, but it's still just getting started. Haven't really gotten any real testimony for today other than the very beginning. Go to our website, Politadick.com. Don't forget to click that support button. You can find this broadcast on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. I'm trying to find out why it's not on NorthTube yet. And you can find it at Politadick and Politadick Unfiltered on Facebook. And within a day, you will find it also on Rumble. Again, please like, share. I will see you back here again at 1 o'clock. Make sure to tune in at that time. And at that time, share far and wide. See you then.